the best practices in the urban planning in order to develop sustainable communities in India. P.D.Rai, Ms. Jaya, Dhindhaw, and Professor Monto who will be chairing the panel discussions today. I also would like to welcome Ms. Seenat Niasi and Ms. Devika Sharma, chairing sessions on 27th and 29th, and all speakers and all participants who have joined us today. I hope that this webinar will be very productive and contribute towards growing network of scientists, researchers, practitioners, and decision makers who can collectively address some of the pressing issues that this region faces, and we look forward to their continued engagement. Now I request Dr. Smriti Basnet, Deputy Director of South Asia Global Hub, to share the webinar agenda and the current and future programs of our future at South Asia Global Hub in Bangalore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Satish. And also I welcome even other participants and panelists, especially of other webinars that we've conducted so far. So with that, I request Maitreyi, if you would just pull up the slides, it will help us tell about our program. So here at South Asia Hub, we have two centers. One is the regional center. That is, we have a South Asia Regional Center, also the office, which was functioning since 2016. And just last year, we also got the South Asia Global Hub. So we have a combination of a secretariat where we work with other networks that are based in Europe, also one in Africa, which is new this year. And we have 3 in Asia, that's in Taipei, Taiwan, and also in Japan. One in Sweden. So these are the global secretariat hubs with France, US, and there are various national committees. And what we aim to work towards is connecting policymakers with society and also community. And how do we translate the science in the best way that we can? So we are a group of scientists, but we work with a lot of stakeholders. And the program that we have designed and we've thought of for the South Asia Hub and the South Asia Regional Program is focusing on 4 of these SDGs that you see highlighted on the screen. That's on the food security, but mostly we want to look into malnutrition. How is it that as South Asia, we can tackle hunger by end of 2030 and also beyond? Also, we're sensitizing the health risks associated with food pollution, air pollution, and also water pollution. In the water security sector, we will be looking into various issues in the urban water scene, but also we will be looking into the risk faced by the communities living in the coastal regions. We have had 4 series of webinars already. That's between January and April, we've already had 4 series, and this is the 5th and the last series, after which we plan to have working committee workshops. So at this stage, we are enlisting all our stakeholders. We want to work with as many people as possible, all experts in the field of these 4 themes that I have mentioned. And going forward, we would want to meet virtually and also in person in August, where we could have a curator program and chapter for a regional summit, where we plan to bring out a call for action statement to all the head of states in South Asia. So we are at this process right now at the very infant stage, that's between January and April. And this is the first webinar in the sustainable community theme. Next, Maitreyi. Very happy to introduce all our coordinators and our teammates here. So you see Anupama, Jensi, Gargi, Joshita, who are coordinating the other sessions and the webinars. And we have Maitreyi, who is moderating and also coordinating the sustainable community theme of South Asia. Very excited about this webinar also on the sustainable community, because we have 18 speakers in total over these 3 days. Also very happy to announce all the chairs already mentioned by Professor Satish. And these were the other chairs. We had Andreas from Water. So all of them will also be meeting on the 29th for a closing. So please also join us to hear remarks from the chair. So we have Andreas from the chair, from the water team, Dr. Ayappan, who is also very famous for his work on fisheries. He's also a Padma Shri. He is a chair and also the advisor for the food security team. We have Dr. Parmesh, who is a pulmonologist and also a colleague here at the Divecha Center for Climate Change. And today we have Mr. P.D.Rai, who is chairing. We have Professor Monto, who is also a professor at the Indian Institute of Science. We have Devika Sharma, who is joining us from Sikkim. We have Zinat, who's always been a part of us at Future Earth. And we have a new member today, Jaya, who is very new to Future Earth. And I request Maitreyi to please introduce all the speakers, give a short bio about them before we begin the session.
I'll just give a brief introduction of all the speakers. Since we have a lot of speakers, I will not be sharing any of the screens, but I'll just talk about all of you. So the first, we have three panel discussions today. The first panel discussion we will start with the first speaker, Mr. Rahul Srivastava. He is the co-founder of URBS and the Institute of Urbanology. He studied social and urban anthropology in Bombay, Delhi, and Cambridge. His previous publications include an ethnography of urbanized nomads around Bombay, a novel published by Puffin, and The Slum Outside, a commentary on Dharavi, co-written by Mr. Matthias and published by Strileka Press. He continues to write extensively on urban issues with Matthias, with their next major publication, Signed Up with Verso London. He brings his background in anthropology and visual ethnography to urbanology, a practice that energizes most of URB's work in Bombay and elsewhere. The next speaker we have with us is Zeenat Niazi. She's also one of our chairs for the coming sessions. She is the Chief Knowledge Officer and DA and Senior Vice President of Development Alternative Group, and also has about 26 years of experience in the social and environmental development sector. She's an architect and planner by training with a specialization in housing and habitat development. She also has additional training in policy analysis and advocacy. She also has 2 decades of experience in design and strategic action in the area of sustainable rural development. So this has included the design of affordable eco-housing models, post-natural disaster housing reconstruction interventions, habitat policy development, and in the last decade, her work has extended to design and coordination of low carbon development strategies for the central Indian region of Bundelkhand and the coordination of climate change adaptation, action and communication, knowledge management and knowledge dissemination for promoting national and global sustainable development strategies. Her current work involves guiding regional planning and institutional strengthening processes focused on local and national action for sustainable development. Then we've got Ms. Devika Sharma Chetri. She is also one of our chairs for the on the 29th session. She has completed her graduation in architecture from Jadavpur University and went on to do her master's in urban environmental management and development planning from the Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand, and Kyushu University in Fukuoka, Japan in the years 1994 to 95. She has served in various capacities in the government of Sikkim, such as the principal town planner, both in the urban development and rural development departments for over 14 years. She was also the Director of Planning, Educational Department, and currently is the Director General, Directorate of Economic Statistics, Monitoring and Evaluation. Her main involvement has been in fields of strategic planning and formulation of public policies and their implementation. She is also a member of various committees which advise the government on different issues. Apart from her government job, she has notable experiences working as a consultant with AusAid, World Bank, ADB, and other various non-government organizations, specializing in the fields of housing, water, sanitation, and livelihood generation. She has also been invited by various colleges and universities to impart guest lectures, many a time on urban planning and gender subjects. The next 2 speakers we have here are Soumitro and Nisha Mathew Ghosh. They are the principal architects of Mathew and Ghosh Architects. Soumitro joined as a partner in Mathew and Ghosh Architects, a partnership founded by Nisha Mathew in 1995. The work is varied across the spectrum and ranges from projects ideas to do with urban environment, sustainability, architecture, space, interiors, product design, and so on. Educated at the School of Architecture, CEPT, Ahmedabad, Nisha has worked with R.J. Vastava. Soumitro Ghosh has worked with Pritzker laureate B.V. Doshi, R.J. Vastava, Nilkant Chaya, K.B. Jain, Jaswant Singh, and others before beginning this collaborative multi-directional practice. Their practice covers urban, people parks, memorials, hospitality, conservation, industrial facilities, corporate offices, religious and residential buildings, exhibitions, interiors, furniture, jewelry, art, and installations. In 2021, Nisha curated, produced the India Pavilion at the London Design Biennale, and she is the 2022 mentee of the Association of Art Museum Curators and is currently working on her project Mountains to Molehills with the residents of Kola Goldfields through her foundation. Nisha has interest in gathering ideas of sustainability through design and bringing gaps in environmental care to empowerment. Soumitro has an interest in crossings of politics, philosophy, culture, and history to understand the society we live in and design for. The next speaker is Anesha Chaudhary. She's the program manager at Asia Initiatives, which is in New York, and the research lead of Asia Initiative SOCC, Cascade of Learning Program supported by the Jacobs Foundation, the Grand Innovation Prize 2021. Her interest lies in research and policy design in conservation sciences and sustainability studies. She has used ecosystem services and human well-being and the capabilities approach for the doctoral research continues to work in the intersection of sustainability, global food security, and nature-adapted conservation action to empower underdeserved communities. This is going to take a while, so I'll move on to the next speaker, Mr. Saswat Bandyopadhyay. He's the professor at CEPT University and project team for the Center for Urban Planning and Policy. He has over 25 years of experience in the urban development sector in the South Asian region with a focus on urban sustainable development, climate and disaster risk reduction, integration of land use and infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and the management of historic cities. Saswat has spearheaded several climate and spatial planning related research work, such as GIS-supported sustainable urban development and smart cities, Government of Gujarat supported regional climatic variability studies, risk-informed urban development and building regulations, mainstreaming nature-based solutions in urban areas, among many others. He has been extensively involved in several Pan-Asia pilot initiatives such as Asian Development Bank Green Cities Toolkits in Asia, a Cities Development Initiative for Asia, localization of city infrastructure investment, prioritization and programming toolkits in India and Nepal, piloting of the World Bank supported cultural heritage and tourism assets based city development strategies and sustainable tourism assessment toolkit for India. He also extensively worked in the field of urban lakes and water resources management studies in the South Asian context in the field of preparation of environmental management plans and strategies for East Kolkata wetlands, Bhoj wetlands, among others. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in urban planning and infrastructure management. His PhD focuses on climate change and urban vulnerability in India. And then the next speaker on board is we have Chitra Vishwanath, who is the principal architect and managing director of Biome Environmental Solutions. It's a multidisciplinary firm of 30 working in the field of ecological architecture and intelligent water and waste design. Born in Banaras to a sculptor father and a homemaker mother, she did her schooling there. She then moved to Nigeria in 1977 and studied civil engineering diploma at Auchi Polytechnic. After graduating from the School of Architecture CEPT in 1990, Chitra started her own practice in Bangalore in 1991. Architectural practice for her has been a serendipitous flow where they at Biome try to make every challenge of material, ecology, and requirements and amalgamate into a design of an ecosystem. She also has been involved in teaching and design workshops too. She conducted a design workshop at Archiprix in 2017 in CEPT Ahmedabad and was the Charles Correa Academic Chair at the Goa College of Architecture in 2018 and a design mentor at NITTE Mangalore in 2019. Her latest academic project has been conducting the monsoon semester at School of Architecture CEPT in Ahmedabad in 2020. Chitra has been a juror at 2A Continental Architecture Awards, Madrid 2019, and Asia edition of YTAA 2020 conducted by Fushedo Mies van der Rohe, Barcelona. The next speaker we have here is Vidya Mohan Kumar, who is an architect and urban designer with over 15 years of work experience in India, Ireland, and the United States. Her work is focused on creating cities that are people-oriented and centered around transit as a part of sustainable development agenda that she is passionate about. Her approach is driven by a research that is grounded and intersectional as a way to understand the everyday urbanism of cities. In 2011, Vidya founded the Urban Design Collective, a collaborative platform for architects, urban designers, and planners to create livable cities through participatory planning. Towards the agenda, various methods that are employed include urban mapping and research, education and capacity building, participatory workshop, public and socially engaged art, publication and public events programming, to name a few. The next speaker we have on board is Mr. Sundar Narayan Mishra.
Sorry, cannot hear you, Gargi.
Can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I think, yeah. If you could also quickly go through this, because everybody, please share.
Am I audible now?
Yes, but I would also request the organizers to share the profile booklet so that even the participants can see it, because we are running already short by 19 minutes. So if you could
I'll just quickly run through the introduction.
Thank you.
Mr. Mishra currently works as advisor, Ernst & Young, and supports Government of Odisha in implementation of SDGs. Over the last 5 years, he was a senior member of the SDG team at Niti Aayog and provided guidance in localization of SDGs, capacity development, and monitoring of SDG performance. He has over 2 decades of multi-sectoral development policy and management experience and has worked with UN India and several state governments. I'll shorten each speaker's bio now because we're running short of time. Next speaker. The next speaker is B. Manjula. Manjula Vinjamuri is a postgraduate in organic chemistry from Osmania University, Hyderabad, India. She was selected for the Indian Administrative Service in 1987. She worked in diverse sectors like rural and urban development, power, information technology and biotechnology, urban transport, education, including medical education and administrative reforms and training department of the government of Karnataka. Currently, she is working in the Directorate of Urban Land Transport in Karnataka as Commissioner and EO Additional Chief Secretary to Government, and is also Director General Administrative Institute, Mysuru. I think I'll have to shorten further now. The next speaker is Dr. Chintan Daftardar, who is a Senior Manager, Urban Transport, World Resources Institute, India. Okay. The next speaker is Balakrishnan Balachandran, who's an urban planner and researcher in Florida, USA. And the next speaker is Dr. Ranit Chatterjee, who's the co-founder, Resilience Innovation Knowledge Academy, India. That's it for the round of introductions now.
Chair of the first panel discussion, Mr. P.D.Rai, to take over the session. And also I request Maitreyi to help Mr. P.D.Rai moderate the session. So over to you, Mr. P.D.Rai.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wonder who all will be speaking in this particular session, if Maitreyi can tell us that, and possibly then call the first speaker. Since we're running out of time, just ensure that the time allocation is such that everybody gets enough time to say their piece, as well as a request to all the panelists to speak as within the time frame. Thank you. And over to Maitreyi, please.
Hi. So the first panel discussion, we will have Mr. Rahul Srivastava, Nisha Mathew Ghosh, Devika Sharma Chaudhary, Sinath Niazi, Soumitro Ghosh, and Anesha Chaudhary, which will be chaired by Mr. P.D.Rai. And Mr.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think so we'll immediately call on Rahul to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this panel discussion. I'll be very brief. I would just like to draw on from the research project, which I will also be later on presenting on the 29th. This is from a study done called Circulatory Urbanism, which was done under the aegis of the SNCF Forum for Mobile Lives in Paris. And it essentially looked at the continuous relationship between the rural and the urban, a factor which is often not considered when we start planning and projecting planning programs for regions in India. There is a very strong tendency to divide the sense of the rural and the urban as discrete categories. And our training as urbanists is always to emphasize this, because there is a certain default understanding that the urban is a consolidation of space and the rural is what is there beyond. And this kind of very mechanistic and excessively discrete differentiation has caused a lot of problems, particularly in the context of our understanding of sustainability and environmental issues. When we were doing this research on circulatory urbanism, one of the policy recommendations we made at the end of the study was the fact that it is important for many countries, particularly India, which have still a very large number of people living within the rural areas, to understand rural-urban connections as very organic and to look at different kinds of units, not just the urban and the village, not just the habitat and the settlement, but also, for example, the district itself as a unit of planning. In India, a lot of habitations are organized in the form of districts, which are in between rural and urban. There is, of course, the category of the urban, which has been around for a very long time in sociology and anthropology, and especially in terms of looking at the geographies and terrains in India. However, it has not been operationalized in the context of planning. So for the panel discussion, I would simply like to underline the fact that beyond the rural and the urban, there lies many other ways in which you can understand spatial formations and how people occupy space and how they require very different kinds of investments. So for example, in the context of India, when all our resource allocation is done either in the form of rural and urban, a large part of a complex reality gets ignored. And we have seen how this translates itself into an inability to integrate issues of environment, regions which are neither rural or urban, which is really a lot of habitats in India, and how this ultimately starts to impact both urban and rural spaces. As urbanists who have been working very closely in cities like Mumbai, we have seen for ourselves how, by ignoring the villages which exist within cities, like in Mumbai, you have the Koliwadas, the fishing communities, which are an integral part of the urban landscape. But because we don't have a conceptual apparatus to understand the rural in the urban, we do not create any framework which is sensitive to the special needs of communities and habitats, which are like the Koliwadas or the fishing villages. As a result, the quality of water in Mumbai, the seas, everything is under decline because there is simply no understanding that these habitats are valid and that they can be a very successful, sort of livelihood-oriented practice around fishing in a city. So if this is only an example of what happens if we ignore the ambiguities between the rural and the urban, and you can see the results. Similarly, we have worked in rural areas and we have found, and because we do not as urbanists make a strong distinction between the rural and the urban, we see a movement between the two as very organic and very intrinsic to India. So similarly, in many parts of so-called rural India, we see that there are so many economic activities which are outside agriculture and in so many different forms, often through a circulatory migratory movement between the rural and the urban. And this movement produces an urban-like infrastructure, even in a rural context. So what is the kind of policy framework which this would need is something which we need to pay attention to, especially because it can actually address issues of environment and sustainability in a very direct way. So I would not like to spend more time, but I would like to put this up for discussion. And then later on 29th, I'll be making a more extensive presentation on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahul. This is fascinating stuff. Actually, right in the beginning, I think Smriti said that I'll be meeting a lot of architects. And I think this for me is really interesting stuff. So the next opening remarks, I think we'll request, who do we request, Maitreyi? Is there an order or should we just invite Zinat?
Yeah, we can invite Zinat.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Zinat, you're Yeah.
Yeah, now, okay. So thank you, Dr. Rai, and thank you, Rahul, for starting that off, because, it sort of puts a little bit of a direction to where you're going. I'm also trying to respond to the questions that were sent to us, which is that connectivity, rural-urban connectivity, and cross learning that we may be finding, and coming from a much more rural sort of development space, both from housing and infrastructure and also livelihood planning, to now looking at urban spaces. I think there is some sort of shifts that I am seeing and I am experiencing, which I thought I would like to point out here. Of course, like Rahul mentioned, I would take a couple of examples later on the 29th. But generically, if I look at it, there is a rural transformation and there is a rapid urbanization, and this intermingling of that intermediate space that we look at. So there is this whole continuum, and all of these processes pose several challenges, which are not necessarily only about population densities or occupational shifts or land use change. The land use change being the most significant aspect of it, but it is, in my view, also about the societal relationships with our natural ecosystems. So, on one hand, we see a lot of studies which talk about the urban and ecological, so the urban ecological footprints being much larger and being much more, in a sense, distantly connected in spatial terms, and that this is growing. But we also, although, I don't have numbers right now, but it's likely that the rate of growth of the rural footprint is rural ecological footprint is probably faster now because of the connections, the road connections, the energy and the infrastructure development that's happening. And on the one hand, we have researchers who have been talking about the fact that dense urban settlements have a greater ability, even in the global south, to aggregate for efficiency, but we don't really see that, especially in conditions like ours, which have rapid urbanization happening and rapid growth, economic growth happening. So here we see, along with growing footprints, we also see growing inequities, growing vulnerability, greater exposure, and potent recipe for catastrophic disasters. And so there are 3 points that I think we need to probably look at in this context. One is, like I mentioned, the relationship between the citizen and with the municipal actors, with the governance framework, and with the natural ecology of the human habitat, the scale of engagement of people and communities, because suddenly you have a larger scale and more complex engagement with the governance processes. And the third, I think, is in this space, planning for and planning with change. And I think these are the 3 key things that we might want to quickly look at. One, rural settlements traditionally have not been formally planned. They have grown organically across the country. They've grown organically. They have emerged from their local topographical conditions, climate, association with the land-based occupations, etc. They have often, they result from and they perpetuate the power structures and inequities like anywhere else, but there is an organic nature to it. The urban areas we see large numbers organic growing, but we also have a very long history of formal urbanization. And an important thing is that in these spaces now, and if you leave aside these intermediary spaces between rural and urban, the settlement planning becomes more formalized. So you have a municipal system that now people interact with, and space planners start to find a role here. And the relationship that societies that have very direct relationship with their ecological system because of their livelihoods, that's we see sort of breaking down. Very simplistically saying, milk comes from mother dairy, and food comes from the sabzi wala or from the grocers, but that's, and so what we see in urban areas as our connection with our urban ecology is much more aesthetic and cultural. So those are the services that we connect with. We don't necessarily connect with the provisionary services of the natural ecosystems in the urban areas or the regulatory services. There is a change, however, happening. So this connection of multiple ecosystem services is much more sort of explicit in rural areas, is not that explicit in for societies in urban areas. However, because of this huge air quality, water quality, health impact issues, there is that awareness, there is that little connect, and this is an important thing because how we value the natural ecology will depend on how then we use that land and that space for development. And so it's no wonder if we don't connect with it from a multiple ecosystem services perspective, that we will prioritize the development of the financial returns from a commercial development rather than the health and well-being that an urban forest might offer. Or encroachment on a lakefront is quite acceptable if it is if it's offering us cultural or other land value sort of benefits. So this is something that we need to change, which I think we can learn from rural spaces. The other point that I was looking at was the scale and therefore the inherent complexity. And that is something that we see much, it's easier to become a collective in a rural space than to become a collective in an urban space. On the other hand, the agency of a collective in an urban space in today's day is much higher than that of a rural collective. So, coming from a civil society that has been engaging with community collectives, I see that distinction. And I believe that that engagement becomes important. It also then connects us to at what scale the social collective is engaging with the system of governance, in that sense, the formal system of governance. Very quickly, very quickly, P.D.Rai, the third thing that I think we must look at is the inadequacy of the static master plan space and designing for change and with change. Is something that is an important thing now in the urban areas, which I don't see very much happening. Probably in the latest master plan of Delhi, we see hints of that coming in, but even there we see inadequacy of the futures perspective. We don't see that very much, and maybe that's something that we can have a discussion about in a later.
Yeah.
Thank
you, Zinat. Very interesting. I mean, I wish we could just go on and on. And so now at this point, I think Devika can come in. And Devika, I just think that, a lot of interesting impulses have come up, in the first two things. I'm not saying you should refer to that, but, a mountain perspective would be in order at this particular point in time. You look at the urban spaces, the intermediate spaces within Gangtok itself, and you'll see a lot of problematics that are emerging. So over to you, Deepika. And I think we should just limit ourselves to at least just about 5 minutes so that, then more questions can come and that those can be dealt with.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi,
yes.
everybody.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, very interesting inputs. And first, let me respond to the question that was posed for everybody. This is regarding the question about rural and urban regions. And just to bring it to perspective, I think whenever we talk about planning or urban planning, that is the reference point here, sustainable development practices. I think we need to view most things from the perspective of regional planning, because every region has a rural and an urban area. There is a continuum. There's also a divide. There are distinct characteristics that each rural and urban area they exhibit. But now I think there is basically some kind of a fusion. And when it comes to the peri-urban areas or the hinterland, the rural hinterland as we speak, you see there's a lot of behavioral changes. because changes brought about by urbanization are not necessarily confined to urban areas. They also spread to rural areas, basically facilitated by increased mobility and penetration of education and media into rural areas. Now, the migrants or the people who kind of service the urban environment and who we also label as the informal sector, they take back social remittances along with economic remittances, and there's an exchange of ideas. There's a change in their behavior patterns, their identities, their attitudes, their skill levels and practices, and over time, even the rural areas start exhibiting some kind of urban values, and the way of life is changing. So that distinction between urban and rural, although there are like I mentioned, that there are distinct characteristics, that is slowly dissipating over time. I think this is one of the key factors, that I see when it comes to talking about regions. Now, as Mr. P.D.Rai mentioned, Sikkim, well, I come from a mountainous state, and my perspective I think I would be more comfortable speaking about the urban challenges that we have in a mountainous terrain. We are not even hilly, we are mountainous. So we've had several initiatives. There is that integrated mountain initiative that was spearheaded by Mr. P.D.Rai in the past. And we've had several engagements and workshops regarding the same. The outcomes have been very good in the sense that, we did, I think, come up with some policy initiative, and which was submitted to the government of India, so that there is a formation of a separate mountain, basically a mountain department, which would be looking at the functions of mountainous regions across India and, the neighboring countries. So the main thing that comes over here when it comes to planning in the mountains is the paucity of land. Let me just bring you in context. I come from Sikkim, and the developable area that is available for any kind of urban development or agriculture development or like industrial development, we are limited to an area of just 12%. That is all the land we have. And here we have the challenges of, constant migration from the rural areas to the urban areas. And what has happened is, due to this paucity of land, a lot of the initiatives that the government thinks that should be put into order is becoming more and more challenging. And as a result, we do see, the same urban problems that you have all over, the country and across the world, that there are settlements, the informal settlements, the squatter settlements, and there is an environmental degradation as usual. And also the urban way of life, which is, replicating across the hinterland. These are challenges which I think all of the urban, growing urban areas face, and we are also in similar, situation in Sikkim. So I was actually more prepared for this, but then when it comes to the mountain areas, I think we can delve deeper, and as we go along, more questions can be asked, and we can bring our mountain initiatives into more focus.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think you've touched on the heart of the problem of paucity of land, which is there, and the great amount of cost for development that accompanies that. So with that, Soumitro, would you like to go, since we've had two lady speakers before you?
Sure, thanks, Dr. Rai. Yeah, reflecting on the question, the distinction between the urban and the rural has increasingly become less clear, or it's sort of merging, and which I think others have pointed out as well. Some are attracting more distinct and definitive long-term movements of people. Others attract more regional movements, which remain more fluid in nature and have varying, proportions across cities and regions for various reasons of economy, security, and and I think this is some work which reflects on what Rahul has spoken about in other forums, where there is a phenomena inside a phenomena which happens. Since the practice of planning and delivery has been largely dependent and affected by the governance structure in our context, it has of course been scaled, from the municipal corporations to the municipality to the panchayat or the block or the gram or the zilla panchayats. Now this, of course, at different levels, while some of them are the choices and the representation is directly from the people, some are a little more indirect, which is at, let's say, the district level, especially, which has a repercussion of either not recognizing certain issues, or maybe not even dealing with them in very specific ways. So the urban areas do most of the planning largely, and the rural areas are perhaps working more on the resource allocation without direct inputs which are for themselves. So somehow there is a gap between identification of the problem as well as how it is to be met in a very specific manner. This kind of structure mostly takes all collections to the center of resource and redistributed afterwards. So largely a sweeping stroke normally takes place, and that resolution has its issues, which are because it cannot be dealt with in that manner. So can there be a midway resolution of looking at a balance which can serve the urban and the rural in a mutually beneficial and specific and negotiable manner, whether it's through MOUs between different levels. It is possible that the higher and larger goals and standards of sustainability could then find reach to the smallest in intent and the methods, which can be very scale and context specific. The density driven urban infrastructure most often is not the solution for the peri-urban or even the rural condition. The crossover format overlapping model is, of course, easier said than done. Its strength lies in its agility, its inclusivity, and ability to react, and its weakness could also lie in its need to redefine parameters too often. So one is considering an overlapping condition, far more real and closer to reality between two ends of the spectrum, which we normally define as urban and rural for ease of definition. So the moving limits and the locations of the overlaps and thresholds of the different natures can now be better defined with different needs, changing needs, and different solutions, which can be very, very specific and hence could be the smarter way of looking at this issue of this divide that is largely being talked about and defined.
Thank you. Can we now request Nisha to take the floor, please?
Thank you, Dr. Rai. So in responding to the question, I want to be able to restate the problem in another way. And of course, Rahul has sort of introduced the idea of that, and it was echoed in a couple of speakers' comments, to really look at regions as being large ecosystems within which rural and urban are just binaries of the terrain and human enterprise. And if for a second we can assume that the idea of rural is fundamentally food and water, and which are balancers, food and water balancers, I would say. And if we look at the idea of urban as being opportunity balancers, then the two are not seen as separate, but as part of each other. And therefore, the key then becomes to evolve and to strengthen eco-social collaborations, which paradigm perhaps we have not fully seen explored. It has begun in many, many ways, but really, if we were to focus our attention there and look at these new models of eco-social collaborations that do not tilt the balance. And this, therefore, is a matter of design, whoever it might be, whether it's policymakers or architects or urban planners or geographers, etc. And in closing, I just want to say that the appropriation of the idea of rural or country, which in some senses is a colonial way of looking at things. The idea of rural or country itself implies a subjugation of it. And are there ways that we can retilt the balance to be a real balance? Yes.
Oh, thanks. That was very, very succinct, and you've introduced something fundamentally very, very interesting. I think it's just the eco-social collaboration, I think, is a very powerful way of just trying to define things. So then final speaker, and after this we'll probably just take the questions from the audience if there are any. Otherwise, what I would request each one of you to do is substantiate some of the stuff that you have been saying with actual well-defined models, if there are any. So that would really help the audience to connect with some of the key concepts that you have espoused. So
can I say something?
Anesha? Yeah.
1 minute, Mr. P.D.
Yes. My moderator is somewhere around. Yes.
Yes. So we have 2 more questions, which we can take up, and then we'll open it to the audience.
Okay, so there is another two more rounds you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Right. So, but then we really have to shorten them if there are 2 more rounds, which means that we'll probably have to do it in 2 minutes flat.
Each. Yeah.
Yeah. So shall we? Yes. First round for Anesha, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rai. So hello, everyone. I am Anesha Chaudhary. I'm joining from New York City, actually. I grew up in Darjeeling, India. And so I have had this unique experience of growing up in the hills and then now living in one of the busiest cities in the world. So, but today I bring a perspective from the development field here. Where, and I will talk about it more in my presentation on the 29th, I think. Yes. So in our organization, what we do is we work with communities in different underserved communities, and we empower them. But we implement this model called social capital credits. And what it does is it takes into account the perspectives of the people. So our founder and president, Dr. Geeta Mehta, who is actually an urban designer, she actually designed this model to address some of these issues that all of you have been talking about. And one of which was to also, address the problem of access, and also to be able to include the voice of the communities for whom these designs are being put in place. So something that we often do in understanding the needs of the people for whom some of these interventions have been designed is to understand through several dialogues to make it more inclusive and to understand what is it that they need and how it would help them. So for example, there are many design spaces. Through our conversations with many communities, we found that there are many spaces, urban and rural, especially in the urban context, where, for example, traditional users of water bodies did not have access to them because of a certain development plan that kind of removed access, and they did not have any access to the traditional waters that they used to use before. And this kind of gatekeeping that results in them not being able to use that space anymore, and then they become encroachers. So therefore, it is so important to understand and take into account their opinions, have continued dialogue with them, understand what they also need, taking into account different parts of the community, also different members of the society, so that there is equity when certain spaces are designed. And for example, safety of girls, young girls, so that, how can they reach certain places in a safe manner. So there were some conversations that we had as a part of our program where women kind of got together and they shared what it meant for them to have a safe space, to be able to reach, let's say, different opportunities of empowerment. So I am not an urban designer expert. I come from a research complete ecology background, and we work with rural communities. But I feel that each of you have put forth some very interesting ideas. And I feel that what I can share is an example of a model where we have implemented to understand how certain spaces can be designed in terms of water access, in terms of different opportunities, in terms of different spaces and infrastructures that communities would like to have access to. So that is what I would like to share right now.
Thank you. So, so now to the next round. I think, Rahul, you can kick off again. I don't want to mix up things because it's already getting highly complicated. So you can start.
Okay, sure. So I'll very quickly.
But if you can just give an example or two to buttress whatever argument you have. Yeah,
absolutely. So the thing is that we must remember that between the urban and the rural, there has been in the last, several decades, a power tilt towards the urban. That because historically the allocation of resources, the way we looked at rural and urban, have always been based on other factors. So in India, because of the influence of Gandhiism, the original planning procedures were always keeping in mind the notion that rural is really where the real India is, etc. Even though the dominant paradigms post Second World War globally has been always biased towards the urban. And then from the 90s onwards, we do see in India also the urban becoming a very strong resource absorbing space. It is not just about, it's not only a balance between, which is an idealized balance. We definitely, it's a very important thing to keep in mind, the fact that the rural should be seen as something where they say the food and water as the focus vis-a-vis the urban as a space of opportunities. But in reality, there is a certain way in which resources tend to be absorbed, and so, for example, from the Indian point of view, when you look at how do you allocate resources, rural versus urban, so anything to do with agriculture is rural, a lot to do with infrastructure is urban, and whereas the reality in India is that they take, for example, the district. The district is a very important administrative reality in India. But the district as a whole, in which people from rural to the urban areas are commuting every day, for example, just imagine any rural district in India, and you will see there's a headquarter. You will see that there are people who live in villages. The villages themselves have families in which some people are working in rural areas, some people have a job in the urban areas. There is people involved in agriculture, but there are also people who go to the city to work. Students go to cities And these are small cities, they're small towns for education, and yet there is absolutely no infrastructure of which is proportionate to their needs, largely because the resources have been allocated either in terms of what urban infrastructure is and what rural infrastructure should be. And this kind of divide is a very classic example where we see the quality of how we can invest in terms of both spatial as well as the natural resources is something which gets completely confused. So we definitely need a paradigm shift in the Indian context, particularly where we should be able to think of different ways in which the rural-urban interdependence is addressed, also in terms of allocation of resources. And just one point I would like to end with is that we need to question, everybody talks about the fact and the whole notion of the future being excessively urban is something which now we all take for granted. Any commentary on urbanism begins by the fact that we are entering into the urban age, that 50% of the population is moving towards the urban, and therefore we must start thinking in terms of the urban as the only inevitable future. The reality is that the way in which we have defined this urban is a very narrow way of defining the urban. There are so many examples of urban-rural intermixtures which actually can make us more sensitive towards the way we look at environmental resources, the way we can translate our sustainable development goals in a manner which is very pragmatic, especially for a country like India. But this is also true for large parts of the African subcontinent, countries in Latin America, and certainly in Asia as well. And we are becoming blinded by an ideology of urbanism, which seems to be propelling us into imagining the future as inevitably urban. All the tools and tools given to us, which are provided to us, are always in the context of this is the future. So the future is often seen to be as inevitably urban. We do need to have a check on this. There's a very interesting argument with Neil Brenner, now in Chicago, earlier in the Harvard Urban School, where he very strongly challenges, as a geographer, this inevitable definition of the future as urban. We need something more creative, in the way. So I'll just like to stop over there with this point.
Yeah. Rahul, that what we are trying to do is, in the interest of time, I think we're trying to club question 2 and 3 together. So we'll come back to you for your question 3. But I think, Zinat, you can try and see if you can combine the two, maybe synergize it, and still, the idea is if you take enough, as much time as 2 questions have to be answered in, then we don't gain anything. But it would be nice if you can kind of club it together and see if you can synergize it in. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I mute again. So let me try to respond succinctly, trying to combine the two. And if I look at the 2 questions that were at the in the question 2 and 3, one looked at this UN Habitat report, which was the urban informal economy perspective, and how do we deal with that, and of course connecting it to education and awareness of sustainability. Very wide, in a sense, 2 topics. But let me begin with the first very quickly to say that, look, the report is dated, it's 2006, but the context of informalization of jobs is probably more relevant now than at any time. We've seen that growing informality. COVID, brought it starkly in our face. And we also see the fact that, if you look at it from the context of rural urban, look at it from the context of how we are addressing resource, using our local resources to create local economies, we see that the formal economy, so to say, has less and less space for people. The efficiency perspective, the technology integration, which has made people in the formal space redundant, and also the profit perspective, and we don't want to deal with people perspective, in a sense, has made sure that you give even in the formal sectors, there is a large labor force which is informal. So you actually contract it out, and you have reducing your own liabilities and your own responsibilities as formal institutions, formal private bodies, or even government bodies. So we need to see it one from that perspective. We also need to see it from the perspective of whether local services in the urban areas can actually generate formal jobs locally. You don't have to make large centralized systems. And so these two things I would like to go back and forth on. And for example, there's this whole informal economy, bringing it into the formal space. How do we do it without losing the flexibility and the advantage that the informal sector has? So the process of formalization, and in that process, it's not just about getting the marketing connects to the informal economy, or the finance connects to the informal economy, but also the social infrastructure and the legal infrastructure and the ability of the informal groups to aggregate, to negotiate. So that part of the of support services for the informal economy, which probably would enable them to become what I call quasi-formal in that sense, is something that we may need to address. A lot of this in the services space I find very fascinating these days, and this is looking at, let's say, waste management, looking at water supply, wastewater management. So these are utilities, and we see from experiences in the rural space that you could actually have very localized utility services even in the urban space, very complex urban situations, and that can bring in collaborative business models, community, private sector, small enterprise plugged into these spaces, and provide you a quasi-formality which brings in the services that the workers require, but also the flexibility that the informal sector enables. And so I think those are the pointers that we need to probably look at as we go forward in addressing the workspace in this largely sort of informal gig economy arena that we are talking about. So I'll just stop at that.
Yeah. Devika?
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just react to what Rahul mentioned about too much of focus going on into the urban areas. Well, it's a reality. I mean, we are going to urbanize more and more. And as the economy develops, there is a likelihood that, more than 70–80% of the population will start living in urban areas, as they are the engines of growth, which we all know, the basics of urban planning. However, I just want to bring to focus that Sikkim was one of the first states which came about with a strategic urban plan in the year 2009. I don't think any other state in India had at that time come up with anything like that. And why I make a mention of this is because we wanted to understand the regional imbalances and what kind of population distribution there is in the various districts of the state. And the objective was also to understand, what kind of services we need to bring to the rural marketing centers, especially, just to improve the health of the rural areas. Why so? Because that would also help in, in containing the exodus of population moving in from the rural areas, where as we know, we have the push factors, due to economic disadvantages, and then the urban areas which have the pull factors due to its services and the economic viability that it so offers. Now, the strategic urban planning, this document that we made, helped us to understand, what kind of population each city should have in the horizon year 2040. We realized at that time Sikkim had 4 districts. Recently, we have added 2 more districts. I need to bring it to focus because we are talking about regional planning as a whole. And Sikkim as a region, if you see, there was a lot of imbalance between the West districts and the East districts and the other districts, the other 2 districts, because 79% of the population was basically residing in the East district, and the urban density, the overall density actually of the state of that particular district was close to 350 persons per square kilometer, which is quite high, in a relatively less populated state like Sikkim. So what happened was, after we decided and we studied, what we did was we rejuvenated all the rural marketing centers, that is the smaller towns. So 22 towns, in a small state like Sikkim, were redesigned and replanned, where the entire, the dynamics of what kind of economic activities, what kind of population, what are the services required, a lot to do with what Rahul again mentioned, like we have the Rurban, or earlier on, we used to have the policy Pura, where provision of urban services in rural areas. So, we tried to do that. And today, as a result, what has happened is, one of the district headquarters, that is Namchi in the South District, was chosen as a smart city, although we never really qualified population-wise. We were inadequate as far as population was concerned, but still we qualified as a smart city, and we could bring in a lot of, programs and projects into the city and, do whatever, so that, the population is contained there. Similarly, we also made a note about how we can rejuvenate the West District, where there is a severe shortage of services, etc. And as a result, the West District has been split into 2, and now there's a new district headquarter over there. So these are all, I think, outcome of the previous studies that we had done. And, we were very glad to share it with the, MOUD, the Ministry of Urban Development, the strategic plan that we had made in 2009. Now, coming to the question with regards to the informal sector.
Devika, you'll have to hurry up.
Okay, coming to the, I think the informal sector and what we need to do and what kind of policy initiatives need to be taken. I am a strong believer that, the strengthening the local governments is actually the way forward, and which is already being done. It's not that we haven't, but you see, the informal sector, because they are marginalized, they do not have a say in the decision-making process of the city. And unless and until they're empowered, unless and until, their grievances and their existence is recognized, I don't see much headway. And I think a lot of our speakers who work with the informal sector over here, and the panelists over here, would be actually in a better position to suggest the different initiatives that would, be helpful. And when it comes to the third question, I think we are also combining the two, regarding the sustainability. I feel the sustainable development goals should be made a part of the.
You have to unmute.
Okay. I think the sustainable development goals for question number 3 should be made a part of the curriculum in all the academic institutions. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Devika. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So Soumitro?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rai. Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, I think, so that everybody can have time. Regarding the informal settlement, I think already Devika touched upon the importance of, a localized and a decentralized approach, which I'm in complete agreement with, especially when we look at informal settlements. And I think the focus needs to shift to not to see the informal sector as something which has to be used as a resource and put under the tax net, or increasingly formalize it, because that will actually make it perish. But the focus, I think, in that case should be on health, safety, and more the qualitative aspects of which should take precedence over any top-down kind of controls. And I'll move on to the third question, which is more about sustainability and the idea of education. And since I've been involved for almost 2.5 decades with the idea of education, and so I will put that only as a few bullet points. One is about, can there be a new definition and an aspirational good life? Good life has meant something which originates from another part of the world, but it also meant things which we now consider as wasteful. So I think if a new definition of good life, whether it's to do with how we live, what materials we use, whether it's to do with what kind of mobility patterns we follow, if that can become more aspirational, which people would find it more willing to accept. We know that change is slow, and it's really slow, but it all has to begin in the mind. That's one aspect. I think recognition of that a large portion of building activity, which is one of the largest contributors to the challenge to sustainability, is through an informal industry, while the large projects seem to be responsible, whether to BRIHA or LEAD or EDGE or whatever of these formal formats, but it's the larger volume which I think can which needs to be addressed, because large projects form a smaller proportion of the overall. The last thing which I want to actually, which is more related to education of whether it's designers or architects, or is that one is that that many of the local building materials, techniques, and details, they need to be recognized. And I think this is where the formal methods of recognition we need to push at them, so that there can be because number of these methods are very, very localized, and because they're localized and not used, and they're non-industrial. So I think on one hand, largely these formats of recognition are based on specification and industrial production, and therefore how it fits into the larger economic model. Here we are talking about where there is a larger proportion of energy, human energy spent, and lesser intrinsic modification of, let's say, a material. So one is talking about materials which are picked up from, whether it's the earth, or whether it's anything, or whether it's the limestone. So one is actually trying to recognize these things as elements. Now, something which I will be talking about in our presentation tomorrow, which is actually about the idea of sustainability and its link with culture, material, aesthetic, and detail, which is rather, I mean, it's in some ways it vibes with the idea of development, which always feels that the local attempt recognizes better solutions, is what I'm trying to recognize through architecture. But I think the biggest challenge in overall has been the general aspiration of people, especially in design and architecture, has been something which is always outside one's own culture. And I think that's something one has to deal with. The last point is about the city, and which is a new challenge after the whole idea of apps and a lot of things which have become very, very precise, whether the delivery of food happens in 5 minutes or vegetables happens in 2 minutes, that there is the loss of uncertainty and the enigma of the city, which I find it very interesting, because while things are becoming more predictable, there perhaps also it has relationship with the aesthetic of gentrification, and it also has how can cities still be generative in terms of unpredictable thought processes. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Nisha?
Thank you, Dr. Rai. So I'll respond to the second question, which is about urban informal economy, by saying that while it is incumbent, and I think most of us agree on this, that it is incumbent on government structures to set the intentions and establish broad goals. However, there needs to be a certain freedom that's allowed into, and it's there to some extent, but to allow local bodies with active involvement of lay citizenry, whether it's designers, young students, social workers, to be able to get into a system to produce to recognize and unpack the nuances of terrain and establish the terrain ecologically and socially, in dealing with the informal sector. So I think it's that level which really is missing, because there's no system to allow this sort of engagement. It happens at ward levels, etc., and you have to sometimes push your head against a wall to get in. So that's a suggestion I have on that space. And regarding education and awareness, I think the only way forward, if we are to have large-scale impact, is to be able to create a large collaborative machine, which is able to move the cogs of this capacity building at every single level, from stakeholders to producers to users to all of that. And because basically capacity building is what can allow a disruption of old cultural habits and allow an allowance for new enviro-social systems and the acceptance of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anesha?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Rai. So I think I echo Zeenat's thoughts when I say that a hybrid system is really what would be helpful and beneficial that would incorporate a central regulatory system and combine it with a decentralized system, so that there is a sharing of responsibilities as well as accountability, minimum wage security, benefits and minimum working conditions, along with some kind of a legal guarantee for the informal sector workers too. Of course, we have to recognize that the informal economy provided a safety net to many people, especially during the pandemic when formal modes of income completely shut down. However, India is a very diverse country with a rapidly growing urban population, and just a single top-down approach, maybe like a one-size-fits-all solution, may not help. And like Zeenat mentioned, may not provide that kind of flexibility and freedom. So it has to have the capacity to be locally contextual and give local bodies some kind of autonomy for better implementation. And also to be able to have these local level associations of the members who are part of the informal economy, right? They are already in existence, and they should be strengthened and consolidated further with more support through funding, through training, so that negotiations with the government can continue and they can also be allowed to organize and engage continuously. So that is what I feel, responding to the second question. And the third, about education and awareness of sustainability. Yes, I think it is very important to make people aware about sustainability. We are just emerging from a global pandemic. The world is facing a lot of challenges in terms of poverty, biodiversity loss, global warming, and climate change. And it is the need of the hour. I know it is talked about a lot, but we still need to talk about more. What can and cannot be best sustainable practices? Sometimes the examples are in our backyard, even within India. I mean, there are so many diverse practices that have been in practice. People have been doing that, I mean, for traditional practices that can be incorporated as best practices for a sustainable future. And I think they need to be, again, incentivized, they need to be supported, and they also need to be talked about. In India, we have a lot of these different awareness campaigns in terms of, and different programs. For example, each World Environment Day, they have the Van Mahotsav, right? Or the Forest Festival, which is an annual festival. This is just an example, but it would be so wonderful to actually link them to the SDGs when they are being, you know, when you have actually children participating in the tree planting programs. And then that is how it would be wonderful for the children, a wonderful opportunity for the, let's say, students of schools and colleges to be a part of something that is global, a global discourse, when they are participating in a national program like that. So with that, I thank everyone.
Yeah, thank you. See, we were supposed to finish at about 11:20 and now it's already 11:25. So Rahul, do you want to quickly say one sentence on the question 3? And yes, then maybe I'll, you know, there is just about time for one more question and then we really have to stop.
Yeah. So I will just only add one.
We'll have a hard stop at about 11:30. Yeah,
sure. Now, just very quickly, I'll say that for in terms of, you know, what is the right way to educate also, you know, our future generations. There is a very important need to emphasize the notion of environmentalism in very concrete ways, not in abstract ways. And the reality of the urban-rural dynamic is something that we need to understand. I completely agree with the earlier speakers that, you know, yes, there is a population shift happening from rural to urban areas, what we consider to be rural to urban areas, etc. This population shift, demographic shift, needs to be understood in a more nuanced way. You know, it is just by rushing into just educating or thinking only in terms of the urban in a narrow dimension is not going to take us very close to what our ultimate and real goals are, which is environmental and sustainable ways of looking at the future for humanity as a whole. So my only one thing would be that we need new categories, and there are categories which already exist, you know, all through the 20th century. We have struggled with the reality of environmental challenges, but we have worked with very, very limited concepts like the urban and the rural as divided spaces. You know, there are people like Anthony Leeds who have talked about the need to look at urban systems. Urban systems are integrated systems which are beyond simply the habitats of the settlement of the rural and the urban. So let us not get blinded by this narrative of the inevitable urban future. You know, this is now very 20th century. The 21st century needs a new paradigm, new way of looking at things. I'd just like to stop there, and I would like to emphasize that we need to get our future generations to think differently.
Yeah. Okay. So we have several questions, but I think we'll just take one. And this is really an open question. So, you know, anyone can say. And the question is, how do we ensure to safeguard rural area boundaries with urbanization? All rural boundaries, forest areas, agricultural areas are being pushed to accommodate high-rise buildings, etc. Who is there to safeguard as land use are being transformed very randomly? We want to safeguard rural areas, agricultural land, water bodies, and everything natural. Basically, I think this question goes to the heart of this whole problem, that the existential problem that we all
added the question
face.
to the chat
can
as well.
Can we get someone to answer this very, very quickly? Who will go?
If I try a little bit first, I think this is what I was mentioning in my first point. How are we ascribing value to resources as a society? And I'm not saying that rural or urban. And when we do development, what are the parameters that we are looking at which define development? And so the moment we start looking at that, we will have to see per se the balance between the value a developed land with infrastructure of commercial whatever hard infrastructure of that nature provides you in the short, medium, and long term for your generations versus, let's say, the forest next door. Yeah. So the idea of bringing in ecosystem service value into the valuation of development, I think, is critical. So I'll stop at that. If that comes into our planning, there'll be much more change that we'll start seeing.
Yeah, there is just one more hand. I think Anesha wants to say quickly.
Yes.
Anesha, we don't have
Very quickly.
even a minute.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, just to add to Zeenat's point, I think, before implementation of a project, I think a participatory mapping activity would definitely help, in understanding different parts and how people value, and have everybody in the community. Like I was saying before, every different stakeholders come together and then they say how they, there are different cultural, associations to forests. So let's say a department, state department may be calling it a forest, but a community would call it a sacred grove. So, things like that kind of understanding, and there's a lot of work out there. I think the research also needs to be connected with the policy and the work. Thank you.
Thank you. See, I'll just, Devika, I can't give you any time. Sorry. I just want to end by saying that it is just fascinating to listen to you, and very, very different perspectives from the urban planners and others. Looking at rural systems, because even as we contend with these issues at an existential level, in our day-to-day lives, I think just taking a step back and then looking at it more holistically makes so much sense. There are some more questions out there that I know, and I'm sure Maitreyi will, route it to the various speakers. You can then respond to them at leisure, but it would be very good to document your thoughts on all of those questions, because they really go to the heart of sustainability and the future that we all want to make. So with these words, let me thank each and every speaker, Rahul, Zeenat, Devika, Soumitro, Nisha, and Anesha for making this such a delightful 1.5 hours. Maitreyi, thank you very much. And
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just call Maitreyi here so that we can quickly follow up with we can follow up with the second panel and the third. And I know all of you have answers to the various questions, so please use the chat box to write your answers there. And now I request Maitreyi to guide us through the second and third panel discussion.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so we'll have about a 10-minute break now before we proceed to the second panel discussion. That will be chaired by Ms. Jaya Dhindhaw, and the participants are Mr. Saswat Bandyopadhyay, Chitra Vishwanath, and Sundar Narayan Mishra. So we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll move on to the next panel discussion. Please do stay back and answer all the questions, because I think the audience all seem to have a lot of them. So thank you so much for all of you for attending it. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon. We are starting the second panel discussion. So we'll have this for about 20 minutes. And I'll be asking both the questions to the panelists in the same round. Ms. Jaya Dhindhaw will be chairing this discussion, and we'll immediately move on to the third panel discussion so that we get some time to answer the questions of the audience at the end of everything. Thank you. Yes, over to Ms. Jaya.
Thank you, Maitreyi. Really glad to be part of this discussion, and it was a very insightful. Earlier, the previous panel was also a great discussion here. So today, and it flows nicely because today we are here to discuss the issues in metropolitan areas. And metropolitan cities, as we know, are becoming focal points for climate change impacts and mass urbanization, which in turn is resulting in growing vulnerability to environmental and social, change and negative externalities. Now, the issues in metropolitan areas are sort of two ways, right? So one, there are the more obvious and the tangible ones, whether, it's waste or water pollution or congestion, air pollution, heat and those kind of things. And then there are the pervasive ones, but which are not quite as obvious, such as, governance and planning. So today, I think with the panel here, and in 20 minutes, Maitreyi, I think we will try to unpack, some of these issues, and we will do our best to get at all the questions that you've given to us. So today for the panel discussion, I have with me, firstly, Professor Saswat Bandyopadhyay, Professor at CEPT University, CUPP, Ahmedabad. I also have with me Chitra Vishwanath, Principal Architect and Managing Director, Biome Environmental Solutions from Bangalore. And finally, Sundar Narayan Mishra, Advisor, Government Consulting, EY, and Head SDG Unit of Orissa. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this discussion with all of you. So without much ado, I'll just start with the first question, essentially, which is about, the planning practice and master plans in India. Now, we know that the present practice of planning in India has its origin in somewhere between the industrial sort of revolution, where, it was done as homogeneous zoning to segregate housing from polluting industries as a health imperative, health and welfare imperative. And now, it came to India, and in the colonial era, basically, it was in terms of planning schemes for housing with sewerage, sanitation system to prevent disease and outbreak, right? So it was basically a health and welfare imperative, and with COVID-19, we sort of came a full circle. Now, cities create long-term master plans, mostly, which is a spatial instrument for land, regulating land use and buildings. And despite the many changes that modernization has brought about, the focus of planning still continues to be, the strict division of the city into homogeneous zones like residential, commercial, basically to prevent mixing of incompatible uses and, to reduce sort of what is known as nuisance in planning terms. And this is sort of a relic of the industrial age, when manufacturing and trade was the primary economic activity in cities, right? And now what we've realized is that master plans are somewhat becoming ineffective as instruments of regulating, planning and development in cities. And we find that less than 20% implementation rate exists for most master plans. So the first question really here is that, are master plans and restrictive zoning regulations hindering the city's ability to grow in a sustainable and equitable way? And if so, how? And I'll start with you, Professor Saswat.
Yeah, thank you, Jaya, and good morning, everyone. Also, my fellow panelists, Chitra and Mr. Mishra. Good morning to all of you. Just let me give you a quick kind of an overview of what is happening when you are saying urbanizing and the urbanizing India. And if you see that in 2011 census, we had about 377 million population, which is about 32% and close to about 7,900 plus sensors and administrative towns. And when you're looking at this and various like United Nations projections that are suggesting, even recent Niti Aayog, that we may be around 600 million by 2030, 2035, and by 2047 or around that, we are expecting about 800 to 900 million. So this is really what we are discussing is a very massive, and also what World Bank calls it as a messy form of urbanization. As you all know, how we define urban and urban center, it has it's a lot of implication in terms of maybe we are more urbanized, the way we are defining urbanization, urban in India. Now, in this, me and my colleagues have been at CEPT, what we are trying to see the physical manifestation of this urbanization in our cities. And when we say urbanizing, and urbanized cities are urbanizing fast, there are various markers. For example, London School of Economic use, like how many people arriving per hour in a city. I mean, you see 60, 70, and we are far, this one marker. The other marker, what we are looking at is that how these large cities are physically sprawling, expanding. And there are, with the geospatial set of data, we start looking at, and two distinct forms that are happening. One is our old core areas are getting redeveloped, and the peripheral areas are actually expanding to the periphery further. And some of the, like I saw, I mean, WRI has done some analysis of Indian cities for about 40 to around 50 square kilometer every year, city like Delhi, Bangalore. We were doing some mid-sized cities like Ahmedabad, Bhubaneswar, and we came across about 15 to 20 square kilometer every year in terms of physical sprawl. And where is this land coming from? Is, the agriculture, the good groundwater recharge areas, and those areas which are coming and getting. Now, in this context, now we have to look at it. What is the kind of prevailing land management tool and options that are available to us in India? We all call it master plan. And I sat down with TCPO and looked at it. Out of 7,900 towns, less than 200 has some form of plan. And out of that, only 32 has where it has been revised. Forget about, we are expecting too much of this whole term, master plan and their rigidity. Most of the towns, what is happening is the growth of laissez-faire. You have a road which is extending, and then people started. So that's one form of. There are several other forms that have been evolving in terms of, how the development is taking place. Cities like what we inherited from British planning system. And as you rightly pointed out, it was mostly from the public health. As you know, the plague in Mumbai, and subsequently the city improvement trust movement. So we have one form which is development plan and master plan. The plans are there, but city, irrespective of the plan, city is growing the way the markets and the development on the kind of local tools and push factor are happening. There's a third form which is also predominant in many states in India, where we prepare a plan, and then from that plan, for the public and semi-public facilities are developed through some form of land acquisition. And that's what, our plans are implemented, or, efficiency of planning implementation. And they remain always a kind of controversial in terms of acquisition of land. A lot of legal cases, because somebody puts a private land and they say this becomes a public land tomorrow for public facilities. And there are another form of which is emerging with, you have a framework plan, and then you have certain land reconstitution. There is certain element hierarchy in terms of city level plan, sub-city level plan, and local level plan. What we never had in India, and that's it, the plan which can be appreciated at more human scale. Like, how a citizen look at plan, that's at the street level, at the public space level, and which also we talk about in terms of urban design interventions, which can be seen as a human scale. So when you say that, rigid form the master plan, what my argument here is that we have never, we have attempted multiple version of something to control and manage our land, but we haven't really worked out something which is needed as what is called spatial planning hierarchy. As you know that, the city also depends on the region. Like, so when you plan a city or make certain intervention, it has a regional influence. And a city also draws from its hinterland, whether it is water. So there is a kind of a dependency with the city and region. And many, the cases is that we need to actually work out a kind of a spatial planning hierarchy, which talks about at a various scales, from the region to city to sub-city to local level. And that framework, unfortunately, we still, and we are attempting some form in, some form of land management from states like Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and we are still learning. But given the forecasting, what United Nations or Niti Aayog is talking about, if we need to actually, become almost double our urban population from 377 to expected about 800, 900 million, I know you always take it with a pinch of salt, these numbers. But we can always see that, that, and also there is an expectation already, there are some estimation that 2/3 of our economy is city dependent. And if that trend continues, so we are actually, we need to really seriously look at it, that how to actually manage our urban growth. And this growth in physical sense is not only the redevelopment and expansion, also provision of basic services. And in the advent of climatic shocks and stresses, we also have to look at how to secure, make our cities and settlements safer. And post-COVID also the aspects of local livelihood and community. So in nutshell, that what I wanted to share is that we need to really transform our cities, the way we look at our spatial planning approach presently. It needs to transform, and we need a kind of a transformative framework, not a controlling framework, to manage our cities. And there are three major perspectives when you are looking at our city development. One is the governance aspect, one is the planning aspect, and third is the management aspect. The governance aspect is, already we talked about, is the 74th Amendment. And as you know, this has not really been realized in many states. We have urban planning, which is, as you just pointed out, less than 20% rate of success. The third is related to urban management. When you are managing day-to-day eventualities like shocks and stresses, for example, air pollution, traffic, etc. So all these three disciplines need to come together if you are looking at our cities safe, inclusive, or resilient. So I'll stop here with my first round of remark. Over to you, Jaya.
Thank you, Saswat. So I think, Professor Saswat has sort of framed this and kind of brought in various perspectives of, what are the issues of the master plan, and, how do we kind of fix it through sort of hierarchy of plans in cities, and, how to go about doing it, and, the governance, planning, and urban management part of it. So what I'll do is basically, instead of repeating the same question for you, Sundar and Chitra, I'll move on to the next question. And this is to you, right? So basically, COVID-19 in a way brought to the forefront the need and importance of public spaces in cities, right? So especially for vulnerable groups, elderly, differently abled, homeless, informal workers, etc. And there are societal segments like, vendors, hawkers that rely on these spaces for their livelihoods. And yet Indian cities are underserved in terms of per capita public space and unable to integrate the informal economy into the design, and the delivery process of, kind of planning for them. Public spaces and the informal economy in some ways are uncomfortable.
Jaya, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Yes.
Chitra wanted to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jaya, I raised hands and I wanted to tell you that I do not want to be talking on the second question at all. Okay. It's not that I don't like it. I've kind of thought over the other two in a different way.
Okay. All right. So Sundar, is that something that you would like to attempt that? Basically, we are saying that, how can we shift a policy paradigm and legislative regime around public spaces to be inclusive of all parts of society and, execute it successfully on the ground?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Jaya. Actually, that's a very important question. Let me take a vestige from the Professor Saswat's very comprehensive treatment of the whole scenario. If we look at planning as a kind of activity, its participation is the central thing. Then urban planning is a disaster in terms of participation. So whose participation we are talking about? What are the institutions who are participating? Local bodies are supposed to be the central piece, central architect or central doer in the planning process since 1992, but they are nowhere very much in the central, picture. And there are a lot of stakeholders, particularly in the urban space, who are victimized or marginalized, who are not attended to, who exist on sufferance. So they are supposed to be participating because the issues of inclusion are very important in the urban space, because everything is heightened, because economic activity is heightened, the governance structure is sometimes is at the weakest. So these are the people who are at most vulnerable situation. So where is their participation? And then you look at the governance process, and of course, participation is very key to governance. But many people think governance in a kind of management in a kind of different perspective. Even you look at from that perspective, what is happening to the management and implementation of the plans which have been made. I mean, at this point of time, like Professor Saswat also pointed out, we have a multiplicity of plans, or probably no plans. Both the descriptions probably will hold good as far as urban planning is concerned, because master plans are only there, in the name, in about 65%. 65% of the urban locations do not have any kind of plan or the name. And then, you have, census towns, which are about 50% of the urban locations, which do not exist in the urban nomenclature, in urban kind of, analysis. And these, census towns also, it's a very, I would say, euphemistic term. It includes all kinds of outgrowths, sprawls, and that kind of thing, which has happened in the vicinity, in the margin between the urban and rural areas. And, we don't know how to actually categorize, how to analyze, how to, talk about those spaces. So in all these things, actually the most, people who are at task, or who are actually suffering, who are not at the attention of public policy, are the people who are, vulnerable, who are marginalized, and who are. So we have actually talked about street vendors in this session as a kind of, but they are not the only ones. Of course, they're as far as economic activity goes, they're a major one. So if we come back to them for a little bit of time, so we have, after a lot of struggle, we have actually promulgated an act, the so-called Street Vendors Act. But it has its own problem. It is not a model act, so everybody has tried to play with it. So I mean, whatever form they have with different states and duties, they have the act at this point of time. And then, most of them have not actually gone the whole hog with it. For instance, legislating the rules, and working out the schemes, and putting in place the implementation system, defining the institutional framework. If you look at all these things, then the act is implemented more in bridge than in actually in any positive sense. And if you look at what the benefit the street vendors have got out of the act and its implementation are not much. To say it a little tongue-in-cheek way, not much, because the town, the committees, which are to be the key architects, key institutional kind of vanguard of the whole process, they are in many cases actually undercut by the municipal institutions, and they are actually not in the scene. And the bribery, extortion goes on like anything. And even in the first place, the act itself doesn't look at the internal hierarchy and the diversity of the street vendors and the other workers which are there. So there is also a kind of bit of big hierarchy within that. You have caste system within that. You have other kind of Indian stratified society manifesting itself in the urban workforce, the street vendors. So there is nobody to look at those. For instance, there are the bottom of the pile in that also. High caste people, staying in the core, enjoying a little bit of facility. Others are actually gravitating to the periphery and suffering all the kind of extortion, exploitation which is there. And the basic services, not much change has happened. They have little access to health and education, and no sanitation in the workplace, and they are exploited. Women and children are exploited as before. They continue to be exploited as it is, across the country. I don't know if there are good case studies. I have not come across actually. I have interacted with some people, but I've not seen much of the light at this point of time. So if you look at the other aspects, like whether they have any kind of what do you call good interaction with the authorities, the answer is no. They have no participation in decision-making process at any level. I mean, that's the larger reality. Maybe some leadership level people do some participation in the committees and somewhere else. But for women, children, for the Dalits and the other most vulnerable people who are actually the major part of the urban workforce, for them reality hasn't changed. But they have to come willy-nilly because the opportunities are very bigger otherwise. So those issues are there. And if you look at the policy space, the planners and others who are supposed to be taking it forward, their approach continues to be tolerate, regulate, and I mean, then it's eventually. So the previous mindset continues. So this is the kind of broad, picture as far as the vendors, street vendors, and others are concerned. And then the overall.
Sundar, if you could just wrap up in 30 seconds, please, then we can go to the next.
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to extend a little bit, telescope the whole thing to a kind of urban employment situation. Then, this is again a kind of place which is basically, it's like, everyone for himself and devil takes the hindmost. That kind of situation, people who have the education, who have the skills, who have the, wherewithal, they are able to actually make the maximum out of the opportunities and other whatever is existing in the urban space. But others, it is street vendors and also in other spheres, other kind of occupations where people try to make a living. There is also this similar kind of situation is there. Maybe with street vendor is one of the most vulnerable groups in the workforce, but others also have similar kind of problems and this thing. So that has to be probably looked at in a better way, and the livelihoods and urban livelihood situation will have to be looked into in a kind of people friendly, people center perspective, where we look at exclusion, we look at marginalization as the major threat, which is actually expressing itself in many different ways. We have to capture that and maybe address that in policy and also in practice. So that's broadly
what I would like to. Thank you, Sundar. So now we'll move from livelihoods into sort of resources, and Sundar, you spoke about that a little bit. But basically, over the next 10 to 20 years, as cities are going to be expanding and developing, we will require a lot of resources. And we know that 75% of India's 2050 infrastructure is yet to be built. At least that's what the McKinsey and some of the other World Bank and other studies say. So given the long lock-in period for infrastructure project, how this infrastructure gets built will in large parts determine our collective future in cities. The other imperative, of course, clearly is climate change. And the recent IPCC report paints a very troubling picture about the fact that loss and damage are going to be inevitable. And how do we manage and minimize that? To the point that also Professor Saswat was talking about is just management, So how we climate-proof communities and infrastructure is going to be a big challenge that is, going to be staring at us in the face. So the question is, how do we integrate the use of sustainable approaches or materials while talking about urban planning from a macro scale, for example, infrastructure development, to a more micro one, for example, street designs. So this one's for you, Chitra.
Yes, but I'm taking a small different approach, a new path, in terms that I'm combining the first and the third. And I'm going with a detail or an example, okay? So in the first one, it's asked how rigid is our master plan and is it applicable to the changing needs? This question looks at the future and considering climate change, as you said, which is our present future, I would bring the focus to temperature rise. This aspect affects the possibility of decent work, which is further linked to food security. So it is all encompassing. Now, with the third question on materials, this is an important aspect with respect to cities. And my input will be, this needs to go beyond infrastructure and public space. India lacks decent housing, and we still have only 2011 census to go to it. And 70% of construction is self-built and low-rise. So materials, quality and availability, which do not impact negatively the ecosystem, is how the future can be a virtuous cycle. In this terms, picking up the rising temperature issue, India and many other countries have set up heat action plan. 19 of 28 states have initiated this in India. And this idea happened in Ahmedabad, where in 2010, in a month, 1,000 deaths occurred. At the moment, heat action plan is largely precautionary, which means it has color-coded warnings for people to be careful and medical facilities to gear up to take up the patients. This has succeeded hugely in avoiding death. NDMA has also prepared city-specific guidelines, and states have also developed their own too, but most of them is like, who's responsible, what should you do, and provide more water and be ready for heat strokes. So this is good. Most of them are precautionary and all this, but the mitigative approach has been only cool roofs. And the agencies of the cities don't talk to each other. So NDMA has this guideline, the states have, but the urban planners don't look at it at all. And why am I talking about this? I feel this is this whole thing, it being only precautionary and a very low level of mitigation, impacts decent work. People can't work. So how do you look at it in an extremely different sense? So, and I begin and I kind of say that this is a most important important statement, that a cool space to work is a human right. Are we giving it or not? Because we know very well climate change and temperature rise. And it's important that we start looking at it, because if we don't have cool space to work, people will not be able to work, then food and the poverty, everything is linked. So, and then with this, heat and energy generation get linked up. Urban planning needs to work at localizing both. In simpler terms, work at cool interiors and smart roofs. Now, because if we say, okay, we cool the interiors, then we're going to be increasing the heat externally. And it's not only the immediate external, we're going to look at the temperature rise because we need to generate more electricity. And how do we design? Are we even talking about shades at the levels of at the lower levels where people will walk? Why are we not designing that? Why are we not thinking about it at all? Let's say, like Mr. Mishra said, what about the vendors? Why are they in the sun? Why isn't it possible that the urban design looks at it in a different way, that there is a possibility, because it's a decent work, there's a possibility of shade and the people are comfortable. This is not there at all. So a new narrative is needed in terms of our hot climate, in our urban planning, complete new narrative. Our urban design guidelines have nothing to do with it. We are working in extremely obsolete terms of FAR, FSI, and densities. And we have engineering knowledge. One way of looking at it in terms of cool space would be thinking of underground. I'm sitting in an underground space. Outside it's 30 degrees. This is 22 degrees. And what does this underground give? It gives you materials to build with. It sounds very simplistic, but it is all possible if, again, everything is connected and understood. So the cities have to push for ecological narrative in the era of climate change. And it has to be granular and decentralized. Instead of this millions of square kilometers as one city, not millions, but it's less than thousands of kilometers as one city, let's start looking at 15-minute cities. And it is all possible, walkable. Let's look at that. And it should be with data, granular data, reliable inputs, and locals deciding about their habitats than a top-down approach, which is what happens. So what happens in Kochi cannot be the same what we decide in Delhi or in Bangalore. each area needs to change. And even within Bangalore, we need to have different approaches at different levels in taking into account the local microclimate even. Taking the two together, I think I'll elaborate this tomorrow a little more with my presentation. I don't want to take more time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chitra. And I think we need to wrap up, but I got a great idea based on your response, Chitra. There's a quick rapid fire question that I do want to do with all of the panelists here today. So, in the West, we have this whole concept of, a mayor, and then, you have strategic plans, which basically say that all the departments in the city over the next 2 or 5 years are going to work on this one problem, right? And everyone is going to come together. They're going to align their resources and their mandates to work on this one problem. Unfortunately, we don't have that system. Yeah. But if you were, mayor of major metropolitan cities in India, question to you is, for the next 2 to 5 years, what is the one problem that you would want all the departments and all the stakeholders of the city basically to spend their energies on, for the next 2 to 5 years? So Chitra, I'll start with you and then you.
I would like to create a map of ecosystems and then look at all the issues. It's a salad bowl of issues, so it cannot be just one. But I'd like to take everything together and then map this out. So ecosystem approach completely.
Ecosystem approach to developing cities. Great.
Yes.
Great. Professor Saswat, same question to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jaya. But I would like to look at the housing component, because housing is the one which dominates our urban landscape, and also, as I say, housing for resilience and resilience for housing, because we are actually generating close to about 40% our GHG emissions are from the construction industry, building industry per se. So I would like to look at an housing which is more affordable, more resilience, and also what Chitra mentioned about cool. Incidentally, Ahmedabad, we have a very interesting program called Cool Roof program in Ahmedabad slums, and where a lot of design and also some of the heat reflective paints are being assessed to look at what is the human thermal comfort in the houses. But my take would be focus on housing, make it more resilient, and contribute in terms of reduction of GHGs. Thank you. Over to you, Jaya.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you, Sundar. Same question.
Thanks, Jaya. Actually, I would like to look at it from a lifestyle point of view, which is for me central to this. So I would say that, try to reduce the temperature of your lifestyle. So that will be the focus. So which will, of course, include housing, but much more than that. We look at our own way of living and how you contribute to rise in temperature in our food, in our dresses, in our use of vehicles, using of workplace, all that. And unless the individuals and households becomes the center of the whole climate change, climate action approach, I don't think we are going to make a drastic disruptive change. So I would like to focus on cool lifestyles, sustainable lifestyles, and back to the individual and household, and try to concentrate all energies of collective to focus on that and make a change. Over to you.
Fantastic. So basically, we are talking about both sides of this, from the supply side, managing the supply side, and also the demand side in terms of behavior change and things of that nature. That's excellent. Well, thank you so much. We are at the end of our panel. Maitreyi, are there any questions? There was one, Professor Saswat, that was directed to you, but perhaps you can take a look at that in the chat box and answer that later. But anything else, Maitreyi, any other question that we want to ask, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, I don't think there were any more questions. I think we can wrap up. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for the conversation. I had a great time. Thanks, Maitreyi, for inviting me. And thank you, Professor Saswat, Chitra, Sundar, for the great conversation. Look forward to more of this
thank you.
later.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Jaya, and all of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Jaya. Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you all. We will quickly move on to the next panel discussion. I would like to call upon Professor Monto to take over from me to chair the next one. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, Professor, you are. Yeah.
Give me a second. Is there an introduction you would be, on the participants involved in this session? Would you be introducing us?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The next panel will be chaired by Professor Monto, and we will have Mr. Chintan Daftadar from WRI and Mr. Ranit Chatterjee, who will be joining us today. Also, Mr. Balakrishnan Balachandar, who is an urban planner and researcher. I think there will be, yes, 3 of you, 4 of you for the panel. Yes, over to you, Mr. Monto.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Can I start with Mr. Balakrishnan, in terms of sharing your thoughts and yeah, please go on.
Sure. So I'll base my points on the 2 questions that were shared in the note, that preparatory note that was sent out. And the first question here is how to implement and execute a sustainable urban mobility plan in an Indian context. What will be the challenges faced by the planners, and what are the probable solutions that can be implemented in an Indian context? Transit-oriented development, or TOD, what are the issues and challenges faced in implementing TOD and the advantage of it? So I wanted to respond to this question. There is one more question, but I'll respond to the first one. I wanted to respond to the question from the point of view of building resilience to disaster risk in cities. So from the way I would like to look at this is that sustainable urban mobility planning, and especially TOD within that, offers an opportunity to build resilience. So our cities are going to be impacted by climate change in the coming years. They've already started being impacted very significantly in various ways. And I'd like to take the example of hazards like flooding and landslides. And we know now quite clearly that the most impacted segments of the population will be the most vulnerable, both economically and socially, because they tend to occupy the most risk-prone parts of the city. So if in the long term, we want to reduce the risk to life and property in extreme climate events, then you will have to change the configuration of Indian cities, favoring higher densities in safer locations and lower densities or no habitation at all in areas that are risk prone. Now, this transition is a very difficult one to accomplish unless there is very forceful policy measures to support this. And one such policy which allows for reconfiguring densities in cities is transit-oriented development. It creates the incentive for people to move from a relatively less served area in terms of mobility to an area of higher mobility services, which is along TOD corridors. Fortunately, this also creates the opportunity, if you do your land use planning right, to use the same mechanism to enable people to move from areas of higher hazard risk to areas of lower hazard risk, which means that the overall city plan, the development plan, the spatial plan has to recognize the spatial distribution of risk and then reflect that in the way future densities are considered. So there is a sort of synergy between a synergy that's possible between sustainable urban mobility planning and between planning for disaster resilience. If this is done, then it'll also provide greater access to services and opportunities for those who need it the most. Now, to make this happen, you need policy structures which will enable truly affordable housing along transit corridors. Now, this has not yet really been achieved because the barriers to affordable housing per se are so huge that affordable housing really hasn't, and for the lowest, for the economically most vulnerable segments of the population, hasn't really happened at all. So that in my view, that's an area of work that still needs a lot of attention. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for keeping it very succinct. Rankit, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for this opportunity. Regarding sustainable mobility, my take on it is first is we have to consider sustainable mobility or all this like sustainable transportation networks, housing. We have to consider the thing as a system within a system. It's not something that we are approaching as a single standalone sector or standalone kind of, I would say issue, but we possibly have to connect the dots. Like it's not about only mobility. Possibly there is also a need within the mobility to connect it with the education, connect it with other such things, so that when we are designing the solution, it is much more holistic. It is much more well thought of, rather than just targeting possibly one single issue. And that's again something which has been the approach for many of the resilient cities. I'll just connect also to the questions, the next question as well. So many of the resilient cities, if you look at it, possibly they pick up one issue that the city needs to focus, city needs to highlight, and possibly with a more economic kind of advantage that will bring to the city. But in doing it, what happens is you are not possibly looking at the other problems which might be bugging the city on a long run, and you create a solution which doesn't stand by itself and would fail if other things, like a cascading effect of other things, would actually lead to the failure of this kind of system that has been built. So that's where possibly that's one thing that we have to be thinking like in terms of system within the systems. The second thing is many times when we are targeting hazard risk, possibly we work with single hazard, whereas we actually in reality are looking at multiple hazards, effect of one hazard leading to another, and many a times the risk assessments don't include it. So the solution also is not designed for this kind of a cascading effect, which leads again to the failure of the system. Third also is when we are looking at new technologies, new products, say for example, like in urban mobility, we are also looking at electronic vehicles introduction into Indian market. Such things would also stand a risk. We are not looking at what kind of futuristic risk that could bring into the system. We are possibly looking at the short-term advantage of it. But say for example, cities like Mumbai, which gets flooded every year, at least a stretch of it gets flooded every year between Sion and Kurla. What about those electric vehicles which are stranded there? What about those batteries which are there in the electric vehicles? So possibly we need to have more targeted thinking about the risk, and how do we look at a more holistic kind of solution to address those risks. And I think one of the approach is to again connect horizontally and vertically in the governance system, so that when we are addressing such risk, it's not just one department, one unit which is trying to do it, but everyone coming together. And I think that's possibly would be the starting point of the discussion. So I leave it here, and I think we can take this discussion forward. Over to you, Professor Mani.
Thank you so much. Chintan, would you like to go next, please?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mani. So the first question which was shared was is regarding challenges faced by planners and including the implementation and execution of the SUP. So what we first as a planner, I would like to just iterate that when a project is planned, it has both the sides, planning and execution. So I will just try to put challenges which is coming in both directions. So the first challenge which planner always face is lack of asset mapping or lack of data. So most of our mobility plans which are made are either having old data which translates into the suggestions or recommendations which comes into picture, or because of lack of asset mapping, they cannot utilize the potential of resource management, so which can actually lead to a better insight and a sequential way of implementation. So therefore, for planners, that data and asset mapping becomes a most important part. And therefore, this we see that even when we bring in, so when the mobility plans are made, usually they are not dependent on multiple institutions. Okay, so we have to bring in different civil societies for planning and decision making, because it is going to impact underground utilities to even the areas which are expanding, though residential or industrial. So how cities are expanding. So if every urban local body is planning in a different fashion, so it may not be a cohesive plan. So bringing all them together, bringing all civil societies together in planning also is equally important. And then a lot of it is missed during a risk management plan, because though the strategies or recommendations being coming from experts are well aligned to the thought process, goals and visions, but like I said, the lack of resource mapping itself and how this will translate to a risk if we are not able to manage the timelines. The technologies which are changing over time, where are the finances? So finances though are seen as from where it will be collected, but how it will be collected to deliver that in a timely fashion? Are they inbuilt in your city budgets or state budgets? How so that has to be planned. And many projects which I have also experienced, which had faced legal as well as political risks, and which actually are under construction, are under implementation, but due to certain issues of legal and political issues, they are halted or they are postponed. So the effectiveness of that plan is not coming into picture, and we are losing into implementation. So implementation, I would say, is a collective action, and the collective action will actually bring more resilience in developing more complex urban systems. And therefore, the coordination of the stakeholders means from formalizing their roles, responsibilities, seeing each actor giving accountabilities to these each stakeholders for this cohesive action, whether it is vertically or horizontal coordination, like vertical in the sense national, state and local level coordination, and horizontal like inter and intra-institutional between the ULB. So how it is going to function. So this also has to be built in while making a plan. So proper implementation should take place, or a proper implementation plan should also be made before going ahead with the implementation. Now, not only implementation, but as a planner, I would also say that monitoring of these implementations is also equally important, because if we are able to map those learnings, whether it is success or failures, how we can measure these impacts. Are we achieving these goals of greater integration, improving mode share of public transport, whether it is about efficiencies, accessibility. So all this, how we are going to adapt in our implementation process. So if we have learnings, so this should be mapped and shared along with other such conferences, and learning can be, best practices can be built in. So other cities also can benefit from it. So that is, I think, the way a planner would think on getting these mobility plans implemented on. Otherwise, there will always be a gap in what is envisaged and what is being. So that is what I see around the implementation part of it. Regarding transit-oriented development, obviously, like Ranit also said, there are challenges also which are coming. Okay. So like giving example of Mumbai itself, what was given. We have the highest FSI in Mumbai in Dharavi, which is practically built, which is 4, approximately 4. While the other parts of Mumbai are not even reaching 1.5 to 2. Okay. So these are the vulnerable areas which are the highest FSI, highest densities, but they have the most poor accessibility. And these are getting impacted, like what Ranit also said, during the rains and floods which are coming every year. And these are the most vulnerable and sensitive areas. So how we are planning it also matters. So how we can encourage them, decentralize it, or how we plan this inorganic growth of urban development, how we can formalize it, that is equally important. And at the same time, I had an experience with Ahmedabad BRT also, where BRT has actually made possible the transit-oriented development work. But it has been limited more to open areas or greenfield development. Like they had an open vacant land for old textile mills, which were rebuilt into commercial and residential. So they were able to attract that. But metros have actually not able to tap that enough. Like even in Delhi, if you will see, there is a good lot metro connectivity, but the transit-oriented development has not been. So it is like a lost opportunity. So many 250 plus kilometers of a network, and we are not able to deliver it because metros have increased the land values, making those areas unaffordable for many people, and therefore wherever the metro goes, people go further 5-6 kilometers away, expecting there will be a last mile connectivity and they will reach in. So how to encourage this transit-oriented development along the metros? So buses are able to deliver it in the BRT system, even in Ahmedabad city, but not, this is happening not along the metros. So we have to also see how people are going to respond to certain things and interventions. How will they be encouraged to do so? And we can actually reap the proper benefits of what is planned. So that is a way we can, one of the ways we can do land value capture and finance our systems. So that is where.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do we open for questions now, or how will we? Can we take some questions?
Yeah, we can take some questions. I had put 2 questions for either of them. Yeah. So there were only 2 questions for this panel. Once this is over, I think we can open the question. Sorry?
Can I read it out now, or?
Yeah, the second questions I have put it as a question for everybody as well. If both the questions have been answered, then we can open it to the audience and all the other panelists.
Yeah, so I just read out the question so that we are clear.
Yeah, I think Mr. Ranit.
Sorry?
Mr. Ranit raised his hand.
Yeah, if it is okay, just want to also add certain things, like especially on this issue of TOD and how it is looked at in India, because currently I'm staying in Japan, and in Japan, the concept is like every, like we call it a school district. In a city, you have a school district. So school becomes your main center for evacuation, for all kind of disaster related activities. So this is a very important aspect when you talk about TOD, that within the walking distance, you have a safe shelter. But in India, the problem, which again connects urban mobility and TOD, is first, the cities, if you have an early warning system, still you cannot evacuate cities. And that's a big, big challenge. Like say, for example, Mumbai, I used to work with the Mantralaya in Mumbai. If you have like a 36-hour cyclone warning, still you cannot do anything. So the whole, machinery of having a warning system actually doesn't help the city because of the mobility constraint. The second thing is, within a small area, where do you evacuate? People don't know. People are not aware. They are not educated. Neither are they willing to go. So the whole concept of such things actually fail. Like say, for example, and this is again linked to security, because people do not want to leave their house without a secure, something which they have earned for their whole life. They don't want to leave it because there would be arsoning, there can be theft. And these are more, these are possibly not planning issues itself, but it's something which is connected. And as a planner, and I'm actually possibly talking more from I would say a disaster management professional, that these all are cross-cutting. So it's just not the planners alone that they can do it. You would need, at first is to understand the problem, and then also understand who are the different stakeholders who can come together. And that's a very important aspect of disaster management. It's no one's business, but everyone's business. I think that's what I wanted to kind of highlight as a point of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the notion of the school being a nodal point and the entire mapping of the the planning or the disaster response, I think it's a fabulous idea. Again, it comes down, I think, to long-term planning, governance. I think governance, institutional coordinations, vertical, horizontal, I think all the three of you actually stressed on that part. It was something that was a common thread that ran through all the three. If I can pose a question to all, how did the COVID change these concepts? That is one. Second is with the internet being ubiquitous today, and the fact that we are doing this entire webinar being stationed where we are without the need for mobility. How do you think that has influenced planning moving forward? Maybe we'll start with Chintan on this.
Yes, Mani. Yes, if we consider various kind of disaster, this pandemic was a very new to our generation. It came almost after 100 years, so no one was expecting the kind of changes it will bring. So things like SOPs for the mitigations were not ready, though the kind of a response which was provided by cities was, we can appreciate that. For example, and I would say the travel pattern which actually changed, and the responsibility which changed from the especially public transport organization. And from public transport, I would give some of the examples from there. When everything was shut and it has to be reopened, so the first thing was to be changed was how people, when they are going for their essential activities, and at least government people who are going for their jobs. So in smaller cities, the distances were not much. So people were still able to reach to their locations, like say 5-6 kilometers by their own private vehicle. So they were not having much of a dependency. But in city like Delhi and Mumbai or Bangalore, where distances are very high, and the vehicle ownership, especially to those who are not privileged to have their own vehicles, for them it was very much limited. And especially when Mumbai locals are not running, then Delhi Metro is not running. So the entire dependency had came on the bus systems. So Mumbai bus systems were actually connected new areas which they have never even entered into, like Badlapur and more peri-urban areas. They have never into. They actually changed their routes, and they were actually doing additional duties and additional kilometers to respond to that demand, because otherwise how the economic needs, basic economic needs of the people will be met. Similarly, where in Delhi, there's a lot of administrative and service oriented people who had to go to job. So they had, because of metro, which almost like 47% more dependency came on buses, okay, than their regular buses. So Delhi itself was, Delhi increased its fleet by 5%, and it increased its vehicle kilometers by almost 18%. To achieve those demands, though the ridership had increased not much, but it was how you are going to make people reach from point A to point B, and that was the only way where people can reach. So Delhi took its initiative. Gurgaon, which was just a year before the COVID had started their operations, they were running 150 buses. They increased their buses by 33%. They reached 200 buses and increased their routes to double. So increased its more areas in accessibility, and they were able to increase their ridership from 70,000 to 85,000 almost like 20% increase, but they were running 50% kilometers more just to improve the accessibility for the basic economic needs. So the way the certain bus systems have responded during this phase, that was very appreciable. Even different strategies were taken by different agencies, like our route systems, which were there since years and they were getting redundant. It was an opportunity to change that, restructure that. Surat tried to push its smart card systems to encourage people. Bhubaneswar rationalized its fare system, and Bhubaneswar was the first city to recover its ridership just by actually not increasing, like many cities increased to recover the revenue, but they reduced the ticket, they increased the passengers and also achieved their revenue. So therefore, every city made its attempt, and they tried to find an opportunity for certain reforms during this period. Now they are more into their normal patterns. Delhi learned that with less traffic, they can increase their staff productivity by 9%. So 3 weeks back, they started bus priority lanes. Okay, around 120 to 150 kilometers, they are testing it and they are monitoring it. So how it is impacting now. So everyone tried to learn from these opportunities, basically seeing this situation as a silver lining to bring those, to take those attempts which were not happening, bring those reforms which were not happening. So I would say, I would appreciate various institutes which were taking efforts on mobility improvement during this phase. They have made a real good attempt. And I think these learnings continue, and they are, with this learning, they are able to make those resilient.
Thank you so much. Can I ask Mr. Balachandran to respond on this next, please?
Sure. Thank you. So I'd like to take a slightly longer term perspective on this. So one of the, I mean, there were many knee-jerk reactions to, the situation that the pandemic generated, both in terms of the problems and in terms of the opportunities. So one of the reactions was that, look, we have been promoting the idea of higher density along transit corridors, and we should rethink that because in higher densities, diseases spread more rapidly. So in a pandemic, higher density would be a liability. Another reaction that I heard from the planning community is now that remote work is so widespread, the impetus to for people and employees and employers to be clustered in a city doesn't exist anymore. So you can have people spread out, it doesn't matter. And so putting these two things together, what would it mean for for mobility planning? Should we continue to push for higher density corridors, or should we look at a completely different kind of mobility scenario? From what I've seen so far, and from thinking about it, my opinion is that the jury is still out on density. I mean, it's too early to predict how mobility demands will change in the years to come, because remote work is, at the end of the day, a luxury for a very small segment of the population in an Indian city. So the impetus for density, I think, will continue to exist. The manner in which density is configured and how that enables better responses in situations like the pandemic or extreme climate events, I think needs a lot of attention. I think in a extreme situation, any vulnerable household would find it easier to manage their situation if they had better access than lower access to goods and services. In my research in coastal Louisiana, when my field work was still going on, is when the pandemic started, and then I had to interrupt my field work and later do it through interviews on Zoom and phone call and all. And I had the opportunity to ask people how things have changed for them. So there are a lot of communities in coastal Louisiana which are remote, remote in an American context, not remote looking at the Indian sort of reality. So I was thinking maybe they have an advantage in the fact that they are away from high density population areas. It was true, they were amongst the last ones to get impacted by the spread of COVID. But it was also true that they had tremendous difficulty in accessing goods and services in that situation, because everything was shutting down. Services were, the level of service was going down in all aspects of life. So this is not an easy question to answer. My gut feeling as a planner observing the situation is that the logic of organizing the city along transit systems still makes sense, and the changes brought about by COVID will be more in terms of how that density is organized at the micro level. I mean, you need planning mechanisms to actually implement the changes that are needed, and very few states in India have the planning mechanisms to reorganize space in the way that it needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask Ranit to respond on this, please?
Sure. So let me just pick up this issue of current pandemic and urban mobility, and also draw your attention to the pandemics that we have seen, maybe in last 100 years, last 200 years. So one change that has happened is we have now started connecting faster, and also along with it, the infection has started spreading faster. And that itself is a challenge for the urban mobility, or I would not say urban mobility as such, but possibly the global mobility issue. And that very clearly shows, if we look at the number of infections and the initial nodes of pandemic, for the COVID pandemic, you would see all of those where the hubs were, like Mumbai, Delhi, and still they are, right? And possibly this is a challenge. How do you actually manage such pandemic issues while designing, planning and designing a sustainable urban mobility? Because the faster we go, the faster it spreads within us. And that itself says that possibly we have not thought about it. That's one. The second issue, again, is about, the increased risk perception that it brought in the current pandemic and the kind of effect that it had on the urban mobility. Like, say, for example, I think Chintan was speaking about how people have started using, buses more, or maybe I would say that people have actually stopped using buses, trains, and other public transports because there is overcrowding, and they have moved into, again, back to their cars because that's more secure. At least the transit is secure. And I saw in Japan, there was a huge rise in driving license applications. I also applied, by the way, to change mine, and I had to wait for 8 months because the thing is, the institutional mechanism was not geared up for this change. They were still running on the older model, which was like accepting 10 applications a month. But then suddenly they were flooded with 1,000 applications a month because everyone wants to ride a car to be safe. So again, this is again what I was saying initially, that you need to connect vertically, horizontally, and think beyond your own discipline. Think where would be the, say, secondary, tertiary impacts would be, and possibly there is the point of failure, not possibly in the primary area of impact. That's the second thing. And third is, again, the change of perception. Like, say, 2019, I remember, I'll just give you an example of Rika. We are not doing anything great, but it was just because of some resource constraint and also thinking like, why should we have an office space? It's much better we use virtual space to work, because the kind of service that we provide, none of our clients are going to come to us and say that, okay, we want to visit your office. Possibly they will say that, oh, you come to our office. So we decided we don't want to invest in a space, but we would like use virtual space, and we can, and that was in 2018. And when we discuss this, many people say, oh, it just possibly won't work, because how will you look at your staff? How will you look at your employee, what they're doing? How will you manage them? But then this whole idea of not working, not commuting to the office, which actually in a bigger city would take 2 to 3 hours of your time. And that is a productive time you are investing in just commuting. If I can save those 3 hours, not have an office, have enough trust in the employees, and ask them that you do whatever you do, at least for the service sector. I'm not saying for the production sector, but at least for the service sector, you do whatever you want to do. I think that, and the COVID has shown that it works. Everyone is now into that mode. So I don't think it's more about, whether it will work or not. It's more about the change in the perception and the willingness to try. Possibly you need a force to make you try. And that's what the pandemic has brought in. A new kind of, this, I would say, survivability instinct has kicked in many of the businesses. And businesses are the predecessors for even the government systems to take up. So I think these are few of the changes that we see.
Yeah, thank you so much. We could now have the panel open for questions. If there are any observations one would like to make.
Thank you, everybody. So
thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all speakers and chairs. I shall be sharing my screen and some of the open questions to everybody as well. If we could have them, please. Just give me a minute. So we had a couple of questions that came through from the chat box. This was answered by Ms. Zeenat, but this is again an open question to everybody. Rural urban migrants often become street vendors in cities that face problems of eviction, bribe payment, inability to access various government facilities. What can we do to make an inclusive design for hawkers and street vendors in India? So this question is open to everybody. If anybody would like to take up the question. Thank you all speakers and chairs. I shall be sharing my screen and some of the open questions to everybody as well. If we could have them, please. Just give me a minute. So we had a couple of questions that came through from the chat box. This was answered by Ms. Zeenat, but this is again an open question to everybody. Rural urban migrants often become street vendors in cities that face problems of eviction, bribe payment, inability to access various government facilities. What can we do to make an inclusive design for hawkers and street vendors in India? So this question is open to everybody. If anybody would like to take up the question.
See, this is a classic, it's been there for decades, the issue of street vendors. And I know the issue has been there in Maharashtra as well, where, how people coming from Bihar, where also sort of, so it's even in Kerala, for example, it's a big issue. Though we know culturally it is required. Even in Europe, I think street vendors, street life, one could call it, is very culturally very inclusive. And I really don't know whether that's going to be a very short answer to get to within the time that we have. But I do know that it's being dealt with for decades. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. Please go on. Yeah.
Maitreyi, I want to just add here that the issue of this, the particular question being asked, is also fundamentally one of inequitable education systems. That someone coming from a small town is not employable in a city, and that's a huge issue that we really need to look at, because that is also a part of sustainability. So that, of course, it's a separate discussion. So that needs to be addressed. And I think in terms of good design for street, to include them, I think, like we said, we need to have local city-based think tanks, which are able to address and look at it from a wide variety of lenses. Because it's not just the jurisdiction of planners, it has to be capacity builders, it has to be educators, it has to be people who are engaged with the community and hearing their cries. So I think it needs the formation of a certain flexible, urban think tanks. It could be very small in scale, but it could be area-wise even, where we're able to really understand the topography and the ecosystem of that area, the ecological issues of that area, and then look at the needs of the particular community, which is, sort of largely prevalent in that zone and wanting to vend for themselves. So yes.
Absolutely. If I can just chip in here, see, the informal sector has probably been the most resilient and inclusive in terms of the diversity of cultures they've been able to accommodate, including, transgenders and, those sections of the community as well. And Bombay is probably one of the best examples here. The other thing that you brought up, even for example, Bangalore, you'll see a lot of students who want to meet some ends meet and who have small stalls put up, foodies, which is relished by everybody. And I think culturally we should be open to have the planning address these aspects. But there are multiple layers to it. These are soft corners for the police. They don't get licenses. There are also issues of drugs also, sort of intermeshing with these activities. So it's very difficult to regulate and monitor, no doubt, but it does make life far more vibrant and inclusive in my view. And I agree, the issue of equitable education, access to opportunities, aspirational, particularly for Generation Z, it's a difficult question.
So Bangalore has done a lot in this in terms of laws, okay, and there have been a lot of interactions between the street vendors and the city, BBMP, and there are also court cases right now in terms of how does a vendor use a road? And it's been very clearly stated that a vendor can use a space which is meant for one car. Okay, so it is allowed by the law, but the traffic police doesn't know about it, or it misconstrues and then takes them away, shoves them away. There needs to be, like I earlier said, all the agencies talking to each other and working this out. So this is very common in Bangalore, and street vending is in fact encouraged by law, but the policemen don't know. Like you're saying, Monto, that there is a lot of other financial issues which comes in it. And must say, during the pandemic, the lifeblood of most of the layouts were the street vendors who came in the morning and did the things. And imagine, that is such an easy way of doing business. You carry your material, you take back your material. You don't have to invest on anything. And why aren't the cities made for people who don't invest, but they're providing services?
Yeah, this is meaning, it's a difficult, I agree, Chitra, I think. It's a meaning, coming from an architecture background, I know, looking for tea stalls at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the morning was so much easier. Even when I was in Pune, when I was doing architecture, now you just barely find any tea shops open. So
it makes it easier to, and it's not a question of employment. We should be encouraging self-employment. They're not depending upon you in any which way. So it's much more important that we encourage this. Yeah,
very true. I'm just stepping in here to help Maitreyi moderate. So I know I also relish, I love going to Pani Puri Walas, and there's so much thinking to go on right now. But let us also take the answers from Zinat and Ranit. They have their hands raised.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Priti, for this. I think one issue that we might want to also address is the fact that the street vendors, there's a limitation of the number of licenses that a city provides to vendors, which means that there are many who do not have that license, and the problems of their relationship with the local police and all of that exists also means that they do not. So combined with the fact that not everybody will have a formal license, the fact that they are subject to the power structure also means that they are not going to be able to grow their business beyond that little one cart or something that they can carry and run once the police wala comes. So that's one aspect that we need to address is how would a business grow? So are we looking at a street vendor as always being at the edge of survival in the city? The space design actually comes to that rescue at oftentimes, but space design then also means these are temporary spaces, and we've seen these in Delhi now very, very sort of almost like a system where there is a whole vendor movement that happens between one neighborhood to the other neighborhood to the third neighborhood, where you see these larger weekend markets or weekly markets that are coming to place, where there's now electricity, there's a system of taking your waste. They still haven't figured out parking, because you realize that actually even the middle and sometimes higher middle class people access these vendor these weekly market spaces. So we start looking at and every day, I mean, you'll see the same group of people outside my neighborhood on a Tuesday will be across the next neighborhood on a Wednesday, will be on the third neighborhood on a Thursday, and there'll be a cycle around it. So there is that also sort of a system that has been put into place. So they're both the daily vendors as well, which require spaces in the neighborhoods, along the streets, along wherever the transits are, where they require systems for electricity, water, waste management, etc., places for their customers to stand, but also these weekly market hearts that are there. Very useful, but all at the moment somehow ambiguously irregular.
Very true, Zina. Thank you for your take on that. Ranit, and then we'll also have Nisha, and we'll end with this question and move to the next question after Nisha.
Yeah,
So,
thank
Ranit?
you. Yeah, just a quick take on this. So I think street vendors is just, I think, one very small part of this informal sector. The problem is how we approach the informal sector, because this is just not in India. I also remember my PhD research in Nepal after the earthquake, 2015 earthquake, and I took up the formality and informality, how it defines the recovery process in Nepal after an earthquake. And it seems that the problem is in in-depth understanding and the data that is available about the informal sector as a whole. Because what happens when the government is designing policies, you need some kind of data set to go through. What kind of policies will work needs some evidences to see that what is that baseline on which are we designing. And for the informal sector, possibly there is hardly any baseline to actually decide on the policies. And that is possibly the gray area which needs to be looked into.
Thank you, Ranit. Yes, Nisha, please.
Yes, I just wanted to react to what Chitra had said and what Zenith had mentioned as well, that, the one car park is officially designated by law to allow, that's the area that is possible for a street vendor to occupy. And Zenith talked about the ecosystem of providing services, etc. So I was thinking that design somehow, the ecosystem of designers needs to back these kind of legislations, so that let's just say that, the land value of that place is high. So can we then multiply layers? Can we have design back these opportunities so that you're able to layer multiple street vendors, maybe at different levels, but designs that can think out of the box and then present options that can be then piloted in a city and, and then locally adapted. Because until we see change, then everything still remains stuck in, where we were. So, yes.
Thank you very much, Nisha, for that. We'll go to a second question quickly. I request Maitreyi to read out the second question, which any of the panelists can take. Could you read that out, Maitreyi?
Yeah. The second question is, does vertical agriculture have a place as a feasible socio-economic infrastructure model in the major cities of India? And would it help ease some of the burdens of the unorganized agricultural sector?
All right. Yeah. Is there anybody who would want to take this?
If I may, because I did put in a point in the Q&A, but I think I put it in the wrong place. But I just read that out. See, in my view, it certainly adds to the range of solutions, at least now. And if you're looking at a large city, there are huge vertical farms actually across the world that are now coming up. So this definitely adds to the range of solutions. But there are two things that I question to myself. One is in our context, how do these current models of vertical farms include people? Because vertical farming and it could be a hobby farming up on your terrace. That I'm not looking at that, because that's something that you're doing, and this is much more of a getting to closer to nature, eating my own food, even though it's only maybe once in a month or once in a week that vegetable will be available to me. But if it has to be done where it substantiates your your daily food requirements, then you need much larger space vertically as well. And when you're starting to look at that, where do people engage? And so is this going to be a model which is much more tech driven, less people driven, or will include human beings in this? So this is a question I've always asked myself, and I don't know right now whether there are models that answer it. The second question that I ask myself is that the ability of the current models of vertical farms to provide cereals is limited. This is still a vegetable fruit. In fact, not much of fruit, much more vegetable. And if you look at the urban models, we are densifying. We don't have bungalow type homes with large gardens or with large terraces that are now that are being available to us. So we are looking at supporting our fruit and vegetable requirements, but not necessarily our cereal requirements. So agriculture for cereal, for wheat, for rice, for pulses is something that will definitely be there. We can't replace that. So that's what I feel we need to probably think through a little bit.
Thank you so much, Zinat. We need a balanced diet, that's for sure. So Chitra, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so I agree with Zinat on that balance. It's important. Everybody is not going to come into the city and then grow their own food. What happens to the people in the rural areas? You see, that's a connect which we have to understand in a holistic sense. So yes, Zinat, we need to grow stuff on the roof, not for our own consumption, but what it could do, and we grow rice on our roof, what it does is to be able to treat your own wastewater. What it creates, and it's not for food, but it's for biodiversity. You have to start looking at it that way. So basically a roof garden, and that's what I was mentioning in my presentation was smart roofs, is where it also treats your waste. Secondly, I think in India, in most of it, it is more of a terrace because the way the sun falls here than the vertical garden. So let's not get carried away with something which is happening in a different part of the world because the way the sun falls. So that needs to be taken care of. And the other aspect is that how do we connect to people themselves? And is there no way that we can start looking at how are we designing our streets? Why do our streets have palm trees? Why don't they just have fruit trees like we had earlier? Why don't they have more of people so that you have more of biodiversity? None of this is being taken. Our landscaping is more hard paved than plants, and the plants have absolutely no biodiversity value at all. Forget food. There is much more than merely looking at buildings or just looking at the city. And then the other connect, which is a very important one, is that let's see cities as positive spaces. And let's see the city's waste as hugely positive. And that would depend upon if we, the residents of the city say, yes, we are going to get food from the rural areas. So let's throw things out, which is good. Our own waste, our own shit and urine is extremely good. Treated to a certain degree and goes into the hinterland and grows our food is excellent. Let's not throw acids. Let's not throw paint into the wastewater. Let's look at it in a complete sense, a connect between the two. Not worry about that, oh, now the hinterland cannot grow food, so we'll grow by making steel structures which have taken energy from somewhere else and grow some salad leaves. Yeah? So we need to have this whole balance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really also encourage, because we do have a study on sanitation here at South Asia Hub and at the Divecha Center, how it can be used as a resource. And I think that is the future also. So with that, there is one question, but I would request the panelists to answer it because I didn't want to go beyond 1:30. But I will take the question, and if the panelists are still around, I would ask Gargi has posted that question. If Gargi or Maitreyi could read that out, it's to do with the database for our informal workers. So Maitreyi, if you could ask the question, anybody, yes.
Yeah. Gargi's going ahead, yeah.
Yeah, hello. So I was listening to the panelists talk about the lack of data on informal workers. So my question is, are the government's efforts towards establishing a national database portal on unorganized and migrant workers through the eShram portal proving to be effective?
Very difficult.
A thought on that to all the panelists?
I was part of a meeting where the Labor Ministry was asking, how do we work with the unorganized sector? You see, there is need to be a clarity on the people who employ the unorganized labor. So these are let's say in construction industry are small-time contractors and masons. And since there's no clarity how they will be affected, they don't try to go and register their labor at all. And during the pandemic, they had to suffer quite a bit. And that's when the whole idea of this understanding of unorganized labor came up. Gargi, we all have to pay a labor cess when we get an approval of the building. Where does the money go? It's in crores of rupees, which is there with the labor ministry. It didn't come easily enough into the hands of the chota contractors at all. So the intentions are there from the government, good intentions, but I don't think the implementation is very clear because of a lot of corruption and other issues there. Zenith may be a better person to tell.
No, these issues, no, I don't think, but I echo your thoughts totally, Chitra. The construction workers community is probably, the most unorganized and most exploited, living on almost on a daily call for work, if there is, and moving very mobile even within the city, which does not lend any kind of support system to come to them, despite the the schools that have been mandated for, and the creches, the mobile creches systems, etc. It doesn't come easily to them. And so for them and for any other unorganized way, I think the social and legal support systems, they're really inadequate. I don't know where the e-shram has gone, very frankly, but if there is any impact of the e-shram, then it's as yet not visible, at least in the practice that we see. So maybe it's too new to say anything about it, but
yeah. Yes, I agree. Everybody, all the panelists, I do, but just reflecting on one example that I learned from Bhutan, where each and every migrant worker coming needs to be registered in that country, and everybody has an employment card. So if we in India also could have that even within the state margins, migrants coming from other states, I think it would answer many questions that migrants face during COVID and such. So maybe that's one angle we can start thinking about, and nudge our policymakers also to do the same, because database is so important. So with that note, I really enjoyed this 3 hours of the panel discussion, and we look forward to the closing. But before that, I would call
Devika.
Yes.
Devika has raised her hand.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I could not see on the screen.
Yeah.
Yes, Devika, there was a question for you, but we were hunting for you in that group. I cannot see her here. If you could push her to the talks.
Yeah, she's here.
All right.
Ma'am, I think you're muted. Yeah.
We can see her from another
screen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes,
We can. Yes.
Okay. I think I'm not visible, but you see, there is this All India quarterly survey for migrant workers, and currently, as when Smriti was summing it up, I must inform you that Sikkim has taken out this very exhaustive exercise of documenting each and every migrant worker, including household help. So there is this ongoing documentation, and I think this will give us a very good database on, what kind of floating population we have in the state. So I guess we are a small state with a small population, so it's very doable for us. But as far as the bigger states are concerned, I think at district levels or whatever, I mean, it can be strategized, and it is a very doable and workable solution.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So maybe from pilot programs and from small states, many of the big states can learn from there. So with that, I end, and I request Maitreyi to please announce the next day's event and also end this session. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. All the chairs, all the panelists, all the participants, Smriti and Satish, Professor Satish, for starting off the session. Thank you all for joining. So I'll just do a quick round of what is happening tomorrow. we have the second day of the webinar, where it will be a session of talks by Mr. George Gabler from JIS India, Jaya, Dhindhaw, Saswat, Bandyopadhyay, Vidya, Mohan, Kumar, Nisha, Mathew, Ghosh, Soumitro, Ghosh, Chitra, Vishwanath, and Zeenat Niazi. So this is what will be chaired by Ms. Devika Sharma. So this will be the session for tomorrow. It starts at 10:30. I hope all of you can join it. And thank you so much. Also, I do like to invite you for the closing on the 29th of April at 3 p.m., where all of you can join us for a bit, where we will have remarks by all the chairs, and it will be a culmination of all the 5 webinars at 3 o'clock on the 29th. Thank you so much. That ends today's session. Thank you all.